Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Bob Kuttner, one of the founders of the American Prospect. Progressive organizing is at the center of the project of redeeming America and American democracy. Joe Biden, rather than Donald Trump, is in the White House, and we can thank an organizer for that, including several on today's program. I'm delighted that we have 15 of America's most effective organizers to discuss every aspect of organizing: the urgency and the challenge of multiracial organizing, the revival of new forms of labor organizing, the mixed blessing of social media, the convergence of divergence of movement organizing and electoral organizing, the synergy and tension between national organizing and local organizing, and the never-ending challenge of getting organizing funded. The Prospect has published several pieces on these issues, and today we will discuss these questions live over the next 4 hours in 3 panels with 2 breaks. We will have opening statements, then discussions among panelists, and then some time for audience questions. The conference will be recorded and available at prospect.org and on our YouTube channel. And if you want more information about follow-up, please go to prospect.org/organize. In principle, everyone appreciates organizing, and yet in many respects, organizing is the stepchild of progressive politics. Funders who will put money into every imaginable good cause often don't get the value of long-term support for organizing. Political campaigns depend on organizing, but far too much of it is short-term and focused on election cycles, and far too much campaign money goes into advertising and consultants rather than organizers. Some elected officials are ambivalent about whether they want to support and bring into politics the radicals who often make the best organizers. One personal story: I came to appreciate the power and ingenuity of organizing when I worked as a Senate investigator in the 1970s for Senator William Proxmire on the Senate Banking Committee. Dozens of community groups came before our committee to testify on redlining and to ask for legislation requiring banks to disclose where they were taking out the community's money and where and how much they were putting back in. This disclosure would give them a tool to mobilize people and put pressure on the banks. The groups organized me and Senator Proxmire as allies. Then they worked with groups across the country to organize their senators and House members to help pass first the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, then the Community Reinvestment Act. That legislation, in turn, energized generations of social justice organizers and even created some friendly bankers. No politician would have thought of this as a policy tool. It took organizers listening to the community and then getting very strategic. So I am delighted that we are all here. Let me give special thanks to Heather Booth, who helped conceive and organize this event. When you want to organize a conference on organizing, you hire a virtuoso organizer. And to my colleagues, our publisher, Ellen Meany, and Anna Greisbord, the Prospect's Publicity and Special Events Director. And now to moderate the first panel, here is the Prospect's Deputy Editor, Gabrielle Gurley.
Thank you very much, Bob, for those comments and for introducing me. I am indeed Gabrielle Gurley, Deputy Editor here at the American Prospect and one of the moderators for this deep dive into organizing for social and political empowerment. This first panel on the challenge of scale, financing, and durability will give an overview of the major challenges facing social and political organizers. We will talk about creating effective, lasting, and fiscally sound links between groups and communities as the country exits the chaos of the pandemic and confronts threats to democracy. As Bob mentioned, we have some of the leading figures in American organizing here today, and I'll be introducing them, each of them, before they give their opening comments. If you had questions anytime during the panel or at any time during the forum, please send them to events@prospect.org. We'll first hear from Heather Booth. She started organizing in the 1960s, civil rights, anti-Vietnam War, and women's movements. She was the founding director of Midwest Academy in Chicago and is now president of the Academy, a training center for social change leaders and advocates. A documentary about her life in organizing, Heather Booth, Changing the World, has been featured on the World Channel by PBS. Heather is now going to describe her main strategic priorities for this moment in time. Welcome, Heather.
And thank you so much. If we organize, we can change the world. But if we don't organize, the world is going to change us in ways we don't want to see. Never in my lifetime have the opportunities, if we organize, and the dangers, if we don't, have been so great. We all worked our hearts out last year to elect Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, and we now have a once-in-a-generation opening to achieve progressive change that we could only have hoped for in the future, cutting child poverty in half, addressing climate, restoring workers' rights to organize unions, transforming policing, bringing immigrants out of the shadows and onto a pathway to citizenship, and much more. But we're also in increasing danger of resurgent racism, authoritarianism, and to use the F word, and I don't use it lightly, fascism. We've seen it around the world and in our own country after Reconstruction, how authoritarians take power under the guise of legality. And here, now, a radicalized Republican Party is methodically removing the guardrails that kept Donald Trump from stealing the last election. Our democracy is on a razor's edge. With the loss of only one seat in the Senate, the Biden program is undermined. If we lose a handful of seats in the House, Kevin McCarthy becomes Speaker. And last year, if Trump had changed about 43,000 votes in 3 states, Wisconsin, Arizona, Georgia, he would have won. The Republicans pushed over 400 voter suppression laws in 47 states to disenfranchise communities of color on a scale unseen since Jim Crow killed Reconstruction. By disenfranchising millions, by nullifying the results of the next election, in gerrymandered legislatures, a one-party Congress, and conservative courts, Trump and his folks could steal the 2024 election, unless we organize as never before. So there are 3 things that I think should be a priority. 1, everyone who's defending democracy and justice needs to stand with everyone else. Movements based on race, class, gender, and generation all matter. Last year, the fight for Black lives mobilized more than 40 million people, young and old, from every race and ethnicity, in the largest social movement in American history, and it fed into a record voter turnouts among African Americans and Latinx communities, in spite of the pandemic and voter suppression. Rising generations built groups like Occupy, which called attention to savage inequalities of wealth and power. The Women's March called out Donald Trump on day 1 of his administration's. Fight for 15 is raising wages for millions of essential but exploited workers. The Dreamers are fighting for those for whom America is an aspiration and an achievement, but not a piece of paper. We come from different places, but we have many roads to victory, and we need to march in the same direction. I call this love at the center, a caring community of passionate change makers. Number 2, I think we need to build a strategically integrated infrastructure at every level. Everything we do matters. Tying our issue campaigns and our political campaigns, locally and nationally, online and on the ground, engaging our base and persuading those not yet persuaded, building deep in communities that's so important and needed to make organizations that last, and converting that power into electoral victories to win public office, make policy, and hold public officials accountable. Connecting all our activity in a strategic whole. We've conducted 4 years of resistance. I have my pussy hat here when resistance is needed, and it still is needed, from police killings of civilians to immigrants exploited and deported, workers fired for organizing, women harassed for speaking out, and marginalized communities subjected to hate crimes. And we need to take the fight to the Republicans and keep resisting so their constituents know they didn't vote for COVID relief and jobs and may not vote for infrastructure, childcare, and education. But resistance is not enough. without organizing and moving from protest to power. Third, we need to show that progressive government can improve lives. We should support President Biden's initiatives as we promote bold visions of our dreams. We've helped to make bold change possible, and now we can make the possible a reality. The Republicans are trying to rebrand themselves as a working class party, but only for whites. And its top priority is windfalls for the wealthy. We're a movement for the multiracial working class of all genders and regions and backgrounds. Organizing to win means building for change that lasts. That's what organizing deeply is. Not just knocking on doors at election time, but forming relationships with people so they can recruit neighbors and others, family and friends. Being there when the rent is due and when they don't have paychecks to cover it, coming to trust each other through shared struggle. Some of you have seen the Oscar-winning film Judas and the Black Messiah. The Black Panthers built their program with breakfast for children and medical care and support for people in need, and supporting their communities against official violence. Organizing means working strategically, knowing that what we want to win, who is the power over that now, and how we build our power to gain that victory. Small may be beautiful, but we need to organize at a scale commensurate with the problems we're facing. None of us alone have the resources we need. So coordination is key, and then our actions and alliances, tactics and messages drive us forward with the scope, scale, and power we need to win. We have a rare chance to make history now. We can do this when we organize with love at the center, and we organize, we can change this world.
Thank you so much, Heather. Now we turn to Deepak Bhargava, who is currently a distinguished lecturer at the City University of New York's School of Labor and Urban Studies. He led community change for 16 years and has been active in organizing and social movements for 3 decades. He's the co-editor of a brand new book titled Immigration Matters: Movements, Visions, and Strategies for Progressive Future, published by New Press. Deepak, welcome.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle. And it's really an honor to be with you and with Heather and Ernie and Maurice and Hahrie. I'm really glad to be here today on this really important topic. So I agree with everything Heather said, and I'm going to kind of go in a slightly different direction, which I think complements the big vision she laid out for us. So if we start with the assumption that lasting progressive social change in this country requires massively greater engagement in civic and political life, more members, more leaders, more organization than we have now, not 20% more people involved in social change, but thousands of percent more engaged, not as passive followers, but as real active members and leaders. And if we assume that we want scale and soul, the quality of deep engagement and ownership that comes with organizing, not just being on someone's email list. And if we assume that that kind of growth, exponential growth, won't and maybe shouldn't be funded by philanthropy, I think the question then for us is, what might be the paths to that kind of scale with soul that is durable and financially mostly independent? So I see 3 potential avenues. Some of them are clearer to me than others. The first is government policy. So we have plenty of historical experience of this, the National Labor Relations Act that facilitated unionization and worker power being a classic example. In a situation today where Democrats now have, for however long, hopefully long, governing power at the federal level, how might they use it to consciously foster people's organization? So Republicans have a long track record of using government to defund the left, as they like to say, by defunding Planned Parenthood, ACORN, legal services, and by always choosing to break unions as their top priority when they have power. So I wrote a lengthy paper last fall with some academic colleagues and the input of many key organizational leaders that identified dozens of policies that Democrats could pursue now, including ones requiring legislation, but many that can be done using executive action. Some involve restructuring how programs work so that they foster connections with community or labor organizations, like connecting unemployed workers to unions when they seek unemployment benefits. Others involve direct funding for benefit outreach for things like the child tax credit by benefit navigators at community organizations. Still others involve creating organizing handles, points of leverage that create incentives and pathways for civic organizations to intervene, for example, through co-enforcement strategies of civil rights or labor laws. Some of these strategies are actually being pursued now, which is very exciting and implemented. Others are not yet. But over the long term, I think this is a hugely promising and important line of work that needs to be socialized in our movements and among policymakers as part of what we routinely do and how we think about things, and not just at the federal level. The second path I see is innovations in the craft of how we do organizing itself and how we raise money for it. So I think there's a lot of interesting ferment and creativity out there. So for example, the Progressive Multiplier Fund has been working with organizing groups around the country to take promising revenue generation strategies and to scale them. And thus far, for every $1 invested, there's been a $6 return to organizing. Wide range of techniques are being piloted and experimented with, but a lot of them revolve around returning to the fundamentals of membership dues, which I find very encouraging. An organizing example, some of the largest membership-based immigrant rights organizations in the country have built up by integrating services, such as immigration services, with organizing. And in places like New York, Maryland, and California, these organizations are operating at a substantial scale that are political powerhouses that are owned by their community members. Last thing I'll say on this second point is that innovation in the craft actually, to me, is a return to very old principles, moving how we invest much more responsibility for organizing, including the work of strategy, in unpaid volunteer member leadership. And that is a culture that I think has deteriorated in some parts of our movement and that needs to be revived. The third path is a movement path. Historically, explosive as opposed to incremental growth in organizational membership has happened when social movements get millions of people energized. So before there was a union movement, there were worker movements, and that energy got consolidated into permanent organizations. So we're now living in a golden age of social movements in this country. How might that unprecedented wave of talent and energy translate into building permanent mass organizations? Running out of time, I was going to talk a little bit about the Fight for 15, which I've had a little bit of involvement with as an example, but there's so many more possibilities that I see. But I think the synergy between movements and organization, it's both the most challenging of these three paths to figure out, but it probably offers the greatest potential for breakthroughs in the kind of scale and sustainability that we need. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Deepak, and hold that thought on Fight for 15. Next, we'll turn to Maurice Mitchell, who is a nationally recognized social movement strategist and a founding leader in the movement for Black Lives. He became the national director of the Working Families Party in 2018. Maurice.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate Heather and Deepak's contributions. And looking forward to hearing Ernesto and Hahrie. And I think I'm going to kind of respond to what I've already heard to sort of, I guess, progress this conversation. And I'd like to lean into something that Deepak offered around how we may innovate organizing. And I'm going to use an analogy that I hope will be helpful. So I, after a personal trauma, I started training capoeira, which is a Brazilian martial arts with its origins in Africa and the struggle against slavery in Brazil. And as I started to train this martial art, I started to make some discoveries about how training this martial art applies to the world around me, to my life, and to organizing. And it's interesting in martial arts, there's different types of training, right? So there's like the classical martial arts. If you ever see like a martial arts sort of demonstration, somebody's making all these beautiful movements, these katas, right? That's what you're looking at isn't like a practical way to engage in self-defense. It's kind of like calligraphy, right? So when you look at a classical martial art demonstration, you're looking at calligraphy. This is like a beautiful exposition of that art, right? Then there's competition. There's rules involved. Everybody understands the rules. It's like, okay, you can't punch in this way. You can't use these types of strikes. And both people will be practicing the same martial art and they score each other. You might have seen this, like a karate competition where there's, maybe the Olympics and the judo competition, right? Then there's fighting. There's no rules. People are fighting for their lives, right? And if you are trained in fighting, you could defend yourself against another fighter. Those are three different categories that require three different types of training, right? And I think it applies to organizing, right? There is the organizing model that is basically a set of decisions that people made based on a particular culture, a particular struggle, a particular fight, right? That's where all our martial arts come from. People in a particular culture, generally people who are at a disadvantage, figuring out how to struggle against an oppressor, right? And that's where you get all these different types of martial arts. That's where you get Kung Fu, that's where you get Judo, that's right. And it's based on that particular culture, the particular struggle, the particular time. When people today are doing a Kung Fu kata, they're mimicking what people in a particular context were doing, right? And it's a beautiful exposition like calligraphy, but it doesn't apply to what we would need to do today. And I think a lot of times what we're doing is we're trying to graft a particular organizing model to context that may not apply, but we feel so rigidly attached to that model that we're performing these katas when we're in a street fight, right? Another way I think this applies is that let's take the example of a martial arts competition, right? Martial arts competition, there's real contact there, right? What I think that applies to in our organizing is like when we create safe spaces. With safe spaces, you're still bringing people on, you're still doing political education, leadership development, but you could assign rules. You could say, okay, this is the language we use here. These are the mores and values that are acceptable here. You could assign a lot of rules, so you could control for a lot of variables in these safe spaces. Generally, it's a small number of people who mutually agree, this is how we're going to be with one another, right? Then there's the real world application of organizing, which I would suggest in this analogy, that's the street fight. You are trying to communicate your values with people who disagree with you, who don't agree with you, who may or may not be ideological, who may or may not identify primarily as being political. You need to be able to engage these folks with compassion, to be able to build with these folks, to be able to grow in meaningful ways. And I think one of the challenges we have in growing and expanding and in innovating organizing is that we don't know when we're doing a kata, we don't know when we're in competition, and we don't know when we're in a street fight. And so we need to engage in proper discernment so that all of those things are valid and good in the right context. Calligraphy is great, but maybe not ideal when you're trying to write a letter to get your friend out of jail, right? The most simple, efficient language in order to do that. That's what you do, right? Legal language is great, but maybe not ideal when you're at the door, right? Ideological language is meaningful when we're a small group of people who agree we're going to struggle around Marx, right? But maybe not when we're trying to communicate with people who don't identify as leftist, right? One of our challenges, not that we do these things, is our lack of intentionality and awareness when we do these things and the efficient use of these things. Last thing I'll say, and I'll wrap up, is one of the ways that martial arts has begun to adjust actually has to do with somebody that most people know, Bruce Lee, right? He trained in Kung Fu, he trained in Wing Chun, And then he decided to do something that was really revolutionary. He decided to create a form that was formless. Basically, I'll take what's useful, I'll drop what isn't useful, but my goal is to be as efficient as possible and as meaningful as possible in how I express my art. That led to what we know now as MMA, which is all about being the most efficient as possible in the use of many, many arts, right? And I think we need to, in organizing, get to where Bruce Lee got to. What can we leave behind? What can we pick up in order to be the most efficient and effective at building the multiracial movement that could grow and expand and have real power in order to challenge capital and white supremacy? Thanks.
Being as efficient as possible is essential. Next, we're going to turn to Ernesto Corte. He is the executive director of the Interfaith Education Fund and the national co-director of the Industrial Areas Foundation, a nonprofit organization in Chicago founded in 1940 by the community organizer Sal Alinsky. The Southwest region of the foundation includes more than 30 community-based organizations stretching from New Orleans to Des Moines to Los Angeles. Corte has received many fellowships and awards, including the MacArthur Foundation Fellowship and the H.J. Heinz Award. Ernesto, we're going to turn to you now. We need you to unmute.
Unmute.
There we are.
Am I unmuted now?
You are indeed unmuted. Welcome.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and it was a great pleasure to hear from Heather and Deepak and Maurice, whom I don't know, but hopefully we'll get to know. And how do you? I can't pronounce your first name. Is Han?
Hahrie.
Hahrie. Okay. Pardon me. These old eyes are getting diminished. I agree with a lot of what's been said, but I want to bring a little bit of a different wrinkle to the work of organizing, or to talking about organizing. And I'm going to say from the get-go, although I appreciate all the national organizing that's being done and all the movements that's being done, where the rubber hits the road for me is at the local level. In San Antonio, in Los Angeles, in Vallejo, California, and Denver, Colorado. And what we're, I think, undergoing is a rather massive shift in our thinking about the way we have to work. And since 1968, there has been an assault on government by both Democrats and Republicans. And I want to emphasize Democrats and Republicans. Bill Clinton and the Clinton administration was as much anti-government as any Republican administration has been. The age of big government is over was not said by a Republican, it was said by a Democrat. The Washingtonian consensus, the neoliberal consensus, was not espoused by Republicans, they were espoused by Democrats. NAFTA was not espoused by Republicans only. In fact, it was implemented because of the work of the Democratic administration. And from my perspective, that was one of the most undermining of workers' power that we have seen, okay? I'm not against trade. I believe in trade. I believe in an ideal of a common market. But a free trade agreement, unfortunately, in my humble opinion, undermined worker power both in Mexico and the United States. And you saw a dissemination or destruction of the Mexican middle class. And as a result, Mexican workers were forced to flee to the United States to work, not to obtain social benefit, but to work. And they were invited to come to the United States by meatpacking plants, by poultry plants, by all kinds of employers. They were invited to come to work, encouraged to come to work in the United States, okay, and then paid the price of being, having to live in the shadow as second-class citizens for many years. And they still are. And, we were talking yesterday to some friends of ours at the Center for Budget and Priorities, and they say there's absolutely no movement right now on immigration reform. There might be something on DACA, But right now, neither Democrats nor Republicans want to take any risk on any political capital on immigration reform. So given that situation and given the assault on government that has been taking place, unfortunately, that assault has had its impact on morale, on capability, on dysfunctionality. And so now we're finding at the local level, our work is to make government work, to be able to collaborate more effectively with local governments. And I'll give you an example. We have in San Antonio, the Cops and Metro Alliance organization put together a very successful workforce development program called Quest. It's been evaluated by everybody. Everybody thinks it's great. And we were able to pass a 0.5-cent sales tax increase to get over $120 million of local money for the city of San Antonio. But the problem is the city of San Antonio, the only thing they know how to do is to evaluate and to measure services and products that they can't deliver. So they know how to do the evaluation of programs that they can't deliver. So we're having to teach them how to effectively work this program because they have their own mindset about how things ought to go. Okay. So all organizing from my point of view has got to be local, number one. It's got to be broad-based. It's got to be institutionally based. It's got to think organized for power, and it's got to identify, test out, and develop leaders. As Deepak suggested, the way right now the cops organizing staff is 2 people, but they mobilize, hundreds and literally thousands of people on elections, and they mobilize volunteers to work with city agencies and city bureaucracies to make the program work. They work with volunteers to do the same thing. We just did a Zoom call in California of 1,200 people on the whole trying to get undocumented workers eligible for the California Earned Income Tax Credit. It was very successful. And I did not ever I'm a Luddite, so I didn't think it was going to work, but it did work. And we got 1,200 people there. Now we're planning another one of 600 people, because we got to do something about what's happening to renters who are being evicted. We have over $45 billion coming into the state of California, and the rest of the country, but nobody's getting the money because local governments don't know how to work the program. They don't know how to apply. They don't know how to make the program work. We found the same experience when we did water and sewer services for colonials. We had to teach the county governments how to make the applications, how to work the program. We had to teach the Texas Water Development Board how to serve colonials because the only thing they ever worked with was large, big developers. My wife tells me I'm going to.
Let me just interject right there. Hold those thoughts about the ties, how national organizations can work with the folks on the ground in communities. Hold those thoughts.
Well, let me just say one thing. One word. We believe in the iron rule, never do for people what they can do for themselves. What we have had is over 50 years of teaching people learned helplessness, learned incapacity. We have to organize to develop a new kind of agency among ordinary folks, who can then do extraordinary things.
We'll turn back to that in the discussion. Right now, I just want to turn to Hahrie Han for her opening remarks. She's an associate professor of political science at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and specializes in the politics of social policy, focusing on the role that civic associations play in political participation and building power for social and political change. Hahrie, please.
Thanks so much, Gabrielle. And it's really delightful to be on this panel with so many luminaries in this field. And so I'm really looking forward to the conversation and excited to learn more from you all. I should note that I think you have an outdated bio on me. I'm actually a professor at Johns Hopkins University as opposed to the University of California, Santa Barbara, because, everyone.
Oh, my goodness.
Oh, no, it's fine.
Many apologies.
No, it's totally fine. I mean, doesn't everyone move from Santa Barbara to Baltimore? So I think the comments that I want to make are actually echoing a lot of what my colleagues on the panel said. I think that I've been in these kinds of conversations before. And when we think about the kind of scale and durability of organizing, and I worry sometimes that the takeaway that people take from it is that like, oh, what we need to do is kind of add a new vertical to our organization that has outreach for people. And I want to underscore the idea that I think what all the panelists here, but certainly I wanted to argue, is that it's much more than that, right? It's about a fundamental restructuring for how we think about what politics is. And that requires new policy maneuvers, as Deepak told us about investment in local government and local practice. It also requires a new craft in the way that Maurice was discussing. And I think I want to sort of pick up a little bit where Deepak left off about this idea of like, it also requires permanent mass organizations. I have to admit to being a little bit relieved that Deepak ran out of time at the end, because I thought, oh gosh, he's going to say what I was going to say, but probably say it a lot more eloquently. So, so I'll pick up a little bit on that thought. Why do those permanent mass organizations really matter? So after the election, I remember reading an article that actually one of Ernie's colleagues wrote in the Boston Review called In Defense of Politics. And in the article, he cited a quote from a British theorist that I really love named Bernard Crick, where he sort of asked, like, what is politics but the public actions of free people? And so politics is fundamentally this idea of people acting in the public domain. The challenge, of course, is that people are not born with the motivations, the capacities, the skills that they need to act with each other to kind of realize the vision of the world that Heather and Ernie and everyone else has been describing for us. Like that's, the work of organizing essentially is the work of equipping people to engage in that kind of power sharing work together. And so what's ironic about that is that the work of doing democracy and making democracy work in some ways is often the work that is the most invisible, even if it is also simultaneously the work that is the most critical. And so the question is, how do regular people in their everyday lives have the opportunity to put their hands on the levers of change, right? To do public life in a way that's grounded in their own experience, connected to one another, and gives them ownership over the process of change. And I want to offer that some of the most fundamental problems that Heather and Maurice and others have been describing, racial injustice, rampant economic inequality, the false pitting of claims that people make about economics versus racial politics, the hollowing of political parties, the inability of civil society organizations to act as a countervailing source of power to the state. A lot of these are rooted in the fact that we've removed people's ability to put their hands on the levers of change from politics itself. And we've created these political structures that are run by professionalized elites that have removed this question of where it is that we equip people to engage in the work of power sharing, of how we do politics. And as an academic, like one of the things that I can sort of point to is that if we look at research in comparative context from other countries, where we look at emerging democracies and other things like that, like one of the things that we learn is that people are much more likely to commit to power sharing, to commit to democracy when they feel like they have status security. So in an uncertain world, like the world that we live in now, status security comes in part from things like economic mobility and things like that, but it also comes in part from the chances that people do or do not have to influence their opportunities for the world that they want and to create the kind of desired outcomes that they want. And so what does it take to do this? Well, this is where the permanent mass organizations come in, right? Because you need to be able to start with individuals, right? Then those individuals work within the context of an organization. That organization creates a culture where we rehearse and we practice the work of democracy every day, and then that acts in the world. And there's like a scaffolding around the work that people are doing. And in fact, if you look at the research, there's research by people like Theda Skocpol and other scholars, who have found that if we look at historically at the growth of membership organizations in the United States, the growth of membership organizations follows the growth of structures for those membership organizations, right? So there's a kind of parallel combination between the structure of opportunities that we give people to engage in this kind of politics and the ways in which people do or do not. And I think so much of the way we talk about politics right now or organizing is about the demand side, right? Are people willing to do this kind of work? Can we draw enough people into our movement? But I would sort of flip the question, which is, how often are we inviting people and giving them opportunities to engage in politics in the ways that we're describing? At the SNF Agora Institute, which is an institute that I direct at Johns Hopkins, one of the things that we're doing is we're undertaking this kind of big mapping project. We're trying to map the universe of membership-based organizations in the United States. And one of the things we found is that so far we've mapped about 1.8 million organizations. Only 22% of those organizations claim members, and only 4% of those organizations claim federated structures within which those members are organized, right? So what that means is that we have a lot of these like big professionalized organizations that are operating ostensibly in the public domain, but are not grounded in the actions of people. And those people are not grounded in structures within which they can put their hands on the levers of change in which we're describing. So I think that's a big challenge to the way that we think about not only this question of how we build a craft, about how we engage the sort of policy levers that we need, but also how we engage people in the structures that they need. And so the last thing that that I'll just sort of say is that I think that some of the kind of skepticism about investing in this kind of work sort of comes from the fact that, you know, people will say like, well, but if we look at the sort of actual data, then people, it turns out, are actually like not good at this kind of work at all. Like they're not good at engaging in democracy, in negotiating people's interests and so on and so forth. And I know I'm at the end of my time, but I'll just sort of offer that that's been true from the earliest days of democracy. And the question has always been not that are people born equipped that way, but how do we create the opportunities for them to learn the skills and capacities that they need.
From Santa Barbara to Baltimore, Hahrie Hahn is the inaugural director of the SNF Angora Institute, a professor of political science and faculty director of the P3 Research Lab at Johns Hopkins University. She studies politics and specializes in the study of civic and political participation, social movements, collective action, organizing, particularly as it pertains to democratic revitalization. Thank you so much, Professor Hahn. We're now going to open it up to a general discussion on some of the topics that our panelists have thrown out into this space to talk more broadly about organizing. And perhaps we can start by circling back to Ernesto's concerns about local versus national. Let's talk a little bit about some of those synergies. Heather started off by saying that everyone defending democracy and justice needs to stand with everyone else. Let's talk about that at the local versus national level. Heather, perhaps you'd like to start with us there.
First of all, I want to thank all of those who are on this panel. Many of you have been my teachers as well as partners. Some of you more teachers at a distance, and I still feel I'm learning from you, from how you show up in the work as well as the work you do. Going back to IAF, working with Deepak on the board of Center for Community Change, reading Hahrie's Prism of Democracy, is one of the co-authors. Did I get the title right? No. Mm-hmm. And Maurice, his dynamism just has been an incredible, and his skill in linking the issues and the elections. I wanted to add kind of what the last comments made me think about were more on picking up on a combination of what Hahrie was saying as well as what Ernesto said. Why people find it hard to stay involved. It's hard to sustain activity over time. And in part, it is organization that helps people sustain activities, but it's also some spirit and attitudes that I think are important that we do through organization that sustains activity locally based with the national. And there are three attitudes that I wanted to emphasize. One is that people feel that there's confidence that they have a right to say anything, that they're worth anything, that their opinions matter, that they would know what to do. And I think often we're frightened from being involved because everything in the society tells us you're not good enough, you don't know enough, you're not smart enough. You're not pretty enough, you're not thin enough, you're not enough. And in fact, re-emphasizing that we are enough. And part of what organization can do, and the support for leadership that Ernesto and others were talking about, is to give people that confidence through the concrete work. The second attitude that I think particularly matters is one of hope and believing that the struggle, which is so hard every day, and people often drop out because they're not sure the struggle is worth the effort. So I think that we also need to be agents of hope in what we do. And I mention it because sometimes we attract people, we think we'll attract people by saying, you know, this is a struggle for the deaf. This is how hard the work is. And, you know, we've had defeat and defeat, but give people a sense of how this builds. Our numbers are building, we're growing. And the last quality that I think is important on this that I'd emphasize now is the question of building community and relationship. It's one thing IAF has particularly taught and emphasized with so many in the movement, that it's knowing that people care for each other, that you are in a community. It's one of the reasons I think the far right wing and evangelical and other groups have prospered, is they make people feel that they're part of a relationship community.
Thoughts, Ernesto?
Well, I'm glad Hahrie brought up, I'm going to mispronounce your name 3,000 times, so forgive me in advance. Required reading of our organizers is Cricks in Defense of Politics, because what we think we do is political work and teaching people, you know, that there is a joy to public life by learning to be political. You know, of course, the quote that I most love is when Pope Francis was attacked by Donald Trump for being political, the Pope said he paid me a compliment, because if being a political person means that you're flourishing, that you're developing, that you're engaging in those kind of activities which make you fully human. The other dimension of that is teaching people the value of political friendship, or philia. And one of the visions that I have is, can you really create a city where people cultivate friendship, a Philadelphia, okay, a city where we cultivate friendship, and we understand that being a friend does not mean agreeing with somebody, does not mean being their buddy. It means willing to be engaging in, you know, constant contestation. But when push comes to shove, they know they can trust you because they got your back, you got their back, okay? Because the concept of philia comes from the order of battle of the Athenian hoplite army, where every soldier's shield covered the backside of his fellow. And so the whole idea of trust emerges when you know that we've got your back. We're going to support you. We're not going to always agree with you. We'll critique you hard. And so we have that kind of friendship where you can go at each other, and but you know that we can always count on you when the going gets tough. And so creating that kind of trust, I think, is central to building organizations which can sustain themselves. The COPS organization is going to celebrate 50 years of organizing in 2024. I hope I'm around to be there for that event. But they've maintained they've now have grandchildren of people who first started the organizing effort, okay? Because they saw not just projects being accomplished, not just victories being won, but also a different kind of agency, an emerging agency among the leaders and the potential leaders.
Just if I can chime in really quick here on the point that Heather made about community and which Ernie was picking up on is, I think if we contrast kind of organizing on the right and the left, one of the mistakes that left-leaning organizations make a lot is they assume that belief comes before belonging, whereas organizations on the right tend to assume that belonging comes before belief, you know? And so the idea is that a lot of left-leaning, you know, issue-based organizations kind of assume that, oh, you know, if I'm an environmental organization, who am I trying to recruit? I'm going to go out and find other people who are environmentalists, right? And then we're going to pull them into the organization and then create create belonging around this group of people that are already on our side. Whereas a lot of the organizations on the right are sort of grounded in communities and ways where people get wrapped into a community of belonging, even without necessarily having belief on kind of political issues that are at stake. And so to me, one of the big challenges in thinking about this question of how I create belonging is how do we create organizations that put belonging before belief, essentially?
One of the ways you do that is connect people to different kinds of people and learn that the relationships matter, okay, more than the particular issue. And so if you can get people to understand that, I can agree with you on the environmental issue, I can agree with you on immigration, I might disagree with you on housing or whatever, but nonetheless, we still can collaborate with one another.
Maurice, then Deepak. Unless, Hahrie, did you have something else to add?
No, I was just agreeing.
Okay, Maurice.
Yeah, I mean, I often think about connection, meaning, and belonging, and how those three qualities really live and are foregrounded in how we think about organizing. I want to add another dimension, but I could wax poetic about those pieces, but I know we don't have time. But the other piece is ideology. And I think that's something that the far right spends a lot of time on investing in, right? And, I think sometimes when we talk about ideology, we're talking about ideology in a academic framework, but ideology could be very, very popular. And I think the far right has proven that, right? So looking at the example of these far right evangelicals, they've done the work over time to embed in all of their work a clear ideological, really visionary, radical sort of destination that motivates folks. And I think sometimes we think that it'll be demobilizing if we don't articulate what the proximal win is, right? And, folks can be committed to doing really, really amazing things that don't necessarily have a proximal win when it's nested in a very clear ideological destination. And, so yeah, we create these communities that provide meaning and connection and belonging, but to what end? And we need to be really sharp and clear about the to what end part, right? I think we've focused understandably on tactics and skills trainings and all those things so people could be better practitioners, but the to what end part that fills people's souls and rouses people's spirits, I think is something that we should be more curious about how we're ensuring that that is foregrounded.
Deepak.
Yeah, I've been doing a project for the last year or so to try to build a new institute to train organizers at the City University of New York nationally, or entry and mid-level organizers of color and women especially. And so we've listened to lots of young people at the very front edge of their career, or not even yet in social change, to kind of hear what's motivating to them. And one of the things I wanted to lift up is that maybe the biggest asset we face with all of the threats that are looming is, to Maurice's point, there are millions of people who have been animated by that sense of purpose, by social movements in these last years, the movement for Black Lives, the climate movement, the immigrant rights movement, other movements. And that extraordinary talent really can be the engine, they can be the architects, they can be the designers of what organizations look like in the 21st century. We sometimes have this attitude that movements are a thing over here. Their movements are from Mars and organizations are from Venus. And people in those two traditions tend to talk negatively about each other. I think that is actually part of the paradigm shift that we have. And this goes to the Bruce Lee analogy that I love so much. I'm going to read more about that. But how to bring the best of those two things together, because I do think the secret lies in the combination of animating spirit and energy together with permanent vehicles in which people can learn some skills about public life and build relationships with one another. And that some of what we'll invent in the 21st century will draw on multiple lineages, not one lineage, multiple lineages that have grown up over the 20th century, and will cross a lot of boundaries that may now seem heretical. But I think that boundary crossing and experimentation is going to be crucial to meet the kind of scale of the problems with the urgency that we face.
Heather, did you want to jump in?
I wanted to both Deepak's comments and all the comments on the panel so far made me want to underscore sort of one broad point. There was a time when maybe each of us would have defended just what we are doing as the thing that needs to be done. And what I feel about this panel is that it embodies, well, there are many differences in our specific approaches, and we've chosen different direct paths in our lives, even while we've learned from each other, that there is a synergy, there is a complementarity, there is a feeling of we are unified, part of something bigger that needs each other, that we need each other. And even though this panel, each comment has been so rich, we don't have enough time to go into each one. There is a sense that there is a bigger whole and that we are all in it together. So I'm just grateful to American Prospect to at least started a taste of these conversations, and maybe we can continue them in your pages as well as in other forums as we move on.
We teach, our work is 80% organizing, 20% mobilizing. So we got to have both, but we can't, or at least I don't think it's, from our perspective, it's helpful or hopeful to mobilize what you haven't organized, or at least, and it's important then to go back and organize what you've mobilized. What I mean by that is that you have to identify leaders and potential leaders who then can seek out other leaders. If we don't teach people how to recruit other institutions, other leaders, relate to other people, then we're not going to grow, we're not going to develop. And so it's really important, in my humble opinion, to invest in a lot of time in teaching the voluntary leaders, okay, how to be agents, how to organize, how to relate, how to organize house meetings, training sessions, etc. As they learn these skills of relationality, of reciprocity, these skills are useful to them in their lives, not just in the movement, not just in the project, not just in the activity, but they find them useful, and that therefore they want to come back for more, and they stay on in the organization 10, 20, 30 years because of the development of their own capacity in the work. And so we think of the work as an ongoing of mentoring. And one final thing I want to say is we got to teach people sometimes to think slow. You know, thinking fast is good, but thinking slow is important if we're going to develop hope, if we're going to develop care and wisdom. Thank you. Appreciate everybody.
So Maurice, if you could talk a little bit about how do you find these folks and plug them into your organizations?
Skillfully. Well, one of the things that I think, one of the skills that you develop as an organizer, and I fundamentally believe that organizing requires apprenticeship, right? And organizing as a skill and a discipline, like we need to protect it as a skill and a discipline, right? Like there's a lot of different disciplines where there's apprenticeship, where there's serious rigorous training, where you have to get a certain amount of hours in order to qualify to do these things. I think some of that has gotten lost, and we need to excavate some of that. But like it took me 2 years of just knocking on a ton of doors, having a lot of one-on-ones before I was able to perceive leadership qualities in people, right? And all of this is like both art and science, but your perception of leadership in others who don't see those leadership qualities yet, that is a key sort of perception that is learned through being in the field, so that you can develop people, so that you can identify people, so that you can recruit people. And, you know, we do it all the time in different spaces. Sometimes, you know, I run Working Families Party. The art of recruiting people who don't see themselves as elected officials yet, and to be able to support them and see those qualities before they see them, and provide spaces where they realize those qualities so that they then run and win, right? Is not something that you pick up overnight. It's only through struggling with folks, and you develop a library of interactions and a library of understandings, so that you're able to have those perceptions of certain leadership values and qualities. Also, it's about defining what leadership is. And I think the way that mainstream society understands leadership is very, very different than how we understand leadership. So all of the greatest leaders I've ever met have always said, like, I am not a leader, I'm just a volunteer, right? And all of the folks who represent sort of that machismo, Eurocentric, sort of alpha male sort of leadership, generally those folks are not the most productive people. The people who raise their hands and want to go to the front of the line are generally not the folks who possess the type of leadership qualities that are necessary for our organizations to grow. So I also think this is a conversation about how are we defining leadership and how are we evolving, how we understand leadership, and how are we able to perceive that even when others don't perceive it in themselves, and then create the conditions to draw those qualities out.
Okay, now we're gonna turn to some audience questions, and the first one I have is, for panelists who've been doing this work for a long time, what have you observed is the biggest difference between organizing when you started versus now, or some of the trends you've seen in the past versus now? Hahrie, is that something you've seen in your research? Some of the major differences between, historically speaking?
Yeah, I think so. I think some of the differences historically. So one is we do see a decline in the kinds of organizations that are engaging people in life in a way that sort of develops leadership, that sort of builds the craft, that creates opportunities for apprenticeship in the way that Maurice is describing. I think that's absolutely true. I think the other thing is this idea that the word organizing nowadays, and I'm curious if other panelists would agree with this, but I feel like people use the word organizing to mean so many things these days. And often it means like any effort to try to get people involved in something, right? So corporations will say they're organizing customers and things like that. But I think organizing the way that we're talking about on this panel is about, grounding people in a set of experiences that is centered around this idea of trying to build power, right? And build power for people to be able to exercise voice in the political system or in public life in different ways. And one of the big differences I think I see from, the mid 20th century to now, where we have the best data, is that now you have a lot more people taking action that might be called organizing, but it's not grounded in this analysis about power, right? And that's not grounded in a bigger ideology in the ways that we were talking about. And so what that means is, one way that we think about it is that's really, you have a lot more people getting mobilized to take action, but they're not being organized into leadership and vehicles for change.
Let's add one thing to that. I agree with that. And I'd say one very positive shift from, say, 20 years ago is I remember organizing with Heather's help, conference on the relationship between community organizations and politics. And that was a controversial topic 20, 25 years ago. Should there be a role for an authentic community organization in voter registration, voter turnout, or political work? And I think that debate has been settled decisively, partly by the nature of how external events have played out. And I'm moved and heartened by the embrace of it as a central strategy, not the only strategy, but as a central strategy for social change. That's been really an earthquake, that I think it's now so normalized that it's not really understood how much that's the water we drink. On the downside, I think, and I think Ernie was referring to this in some ways, I feel like there's a little bit less or significantly less attention to recruitment, a kind of a recruitment culture that asks every day, are we talking to new people? Remembering that new people we meet are not, none of us is born woke, and that the kind of politicization is a process that we all go through. And so I have some anxiety about whether our culture at times, our organizing activist cultures, maybe is the word I should use in this case, can be overly insular and the boundaries too hard, not permeable enough, and that the culture doesn't demand that we be out recruiting. And by recruiting, by the way, people tend to assume I mean, some white rural Trump voter that we should be talking to. I don't mean that necessarily. It could be. I'm for that too. I actually mean people in our own neighborhoods who are not conscious of any organization of any kind. No union, no community group, nothing. And that work is the work of democracy. It isn't actually the electoral work that's the work of democracy alone, right? The work of that recruitment is just fundamental. And I think that culture needs to be deeply and profoundly reinvigorated on the left. That is the measure of how we are doing. That is the number one measure of how we are doing.
Yeah,
Just to do one point.
Wait.
First of all,
I was talking before you.
Okay. First, let's go to Maurice quickly, and Ernesto then quickly, and then we can go to another audience question. So Maurice.
Okay, great. So I'll be really brief. Just on that piece around culture, I came in during the late 90s, so I feel like came in towards the end of where it was acceptable to say, shut up, here's your clipboard, get to work. And I think since then, we've had this, I think, great conversation about self-care and how we're treating each other and how people who are lower on hierarchies are treated by people who are higher on our hierarchies, and also challenging those hierarchies. And I think there's probably been an overcorrection where we've essentially lost a lot of the rigor that I remember coming up in. So we need to figure out how we balance those, how we treat people well. I think it's great that a lot of spaces, professional spaces where there's professional organizing, they're unionized. I think that's great. But I feel like this insular culture that you're talking about is like, you could trip into going from caring about self-care and caring about each other to being so self-referential that we're no longer talking about the power that we need to build out in society. We're obsessive about power relations inside of our relatively tiny organizations, right? And I think this is something that we need to challenge. And like the last thing that you said, Deepak, is like, yeah, our measure should be clear. Any left in any society, it should be judged by how it organizes the working class, not how it further concretizes political lines inside of people who self-identify as being progressive or left or whatever. So.
Ernesto, you wanted to add?
Well, if I could.
Sure.
Okay. Okay. I've been doing this work since 1972 with the Industrial Areas Foundation, and before that with the farm workers and other unions. The challenge for me is to get younger organizers to see the value of doing relational meetings, of doing small group meetings. We call them house meetings, but they can take place in parking lots, in church basements. They can take place in schools, cafeterias. 8, 10, 12 people coming together to talk to one another, to learn each other's story, each other's situation, each other's context. So they begin to see that there's some commonality in all of their struggles, whether it's difficulties with raising children, difficulties with paying their rent, difficulties in the workplace, etc. And to get them to draw meaning and significance out of those kind of conversations, to learn how to listen, okay, and to observe. I have my organizers read a book called The Carpenter and the Gardener, which is about child development. Okay, and the author talks about the importance of thinking: are you there to cultivate and develop a habitat so that the child emerges, or are you there to mold a child in your image and likeness? Okay, and the same is true for organizing. We got to create the context, the situation, the environment for people flourishing and developing it, and through these and that requires a lot of patient observing, attention. Okay, so I resonate with the idea of a guild where there's an apprenticeship, a journeyman, and a master craftsman, and there's peer review for organizers. There's rigorous peer review, and that, going back to that model, seems to me very, very important if we're going to build organizations which last, which sustain themselves over time, which really are about recruiting of leaders and potential leaders. If we're going to have a Zoom meeting of over 600, maybe 700 leaders, and the number one agenda right now for me is, can we put together an evaluation of that meeting of 250 leaders who then see that the work begins after the action. The action is really on them, not on the public officials, but on them to go out and recruit other leaders and other potential leaders, and to organize house meetings, training sessions, etc. And if we can center our work in recruitment And then I think we're going to make something happen. Otherwise, I think we'll fizzle.
Okay. And here is perhaps our last question. The questioner says, here is a paradox. Compare the levels of community and citizen organization today, especially at the local and urban levels, with a generation ago. Much more better, more technically and otherwise adept on the technology front, but also we're seeing more inequality, worse policy in most states and the country. Why is that? We're more technologically adept, yet the policies that are being created are not really addressing where we need to go. Thoughts?
We've moved away from organizing working people. We've allowed ourselves to fall asleep at the wheel and allow, people who are really suave and sophisticated and give us a lot of money to move us away from what is the center of what is the only way to combat inequality, and that is the organization of working people and power organizations of working people. We got to go back to John Kenneth Galbraith's book, okay, American Capitalism and the notion of countervailing power. Ironically, a guy who's considered right-wing by many, Michael Lynn, is the only one who seems to be writing about the importance of working people's organization to counterbalance the power and concentration of wealth, okay, in the financialization of American capitalism.
I think.
Go ahead, Maurice. Yeah,
I think we pretty organically use the technology that's available to us to communicate. So, like the mimeograph machine was revolutionary. It allowed you to be able to make communications very quickly and be able to share them. In some ways, social media is our mimeograph machine. It's available to us, so we use it to communicate. I do think that there is a undeniably corrosive nature around social media. That mimeograph machine, you bought it, you owned it. Social media is owned by a few historically wealthy white men that have no accountability, and the social media algorithms are problematic. I do think that there is a hack that I think leans us into thinking that we're doing work that we're not doing, because we can reach a lot of people through social media, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that we're reaching densities of the people that we need to reach in order to build power. So you could retweet things and you could go viral, and that is a useful tool. That does not necessarily mean that you're building power, you're organizing people. And I think it's important that we are able to discern the difference between those things. And we're seeing communities that are coming together in social media, sometimes in the thousands, but those communities actually don't exist in any density in any place. And we need to be able to recognize that. So you'll see a swarm of people in a community, an online community that might be in the tens of thousands, make a point or a political point, and it might give the impression that political point lives in the political lives of people in communities, in physical communities, when it actually really lives online. It doesn't mean that that's not real, but it's almost like a separate plane of reality that needs to be assessed based on the rules of social media. And I think we're having trouble discerning between the two. And sometimes, because so many political people and people in the media live in Twitter and spend a lot of time on Twitter, we're drawing the wrong political conclusions from our online life, and we're grafting those political conclusions from what's popular online to what's happening in our communities. And I think that's actually been really problematic and corrosive to us as strategists making the correct assessments of what needs to be done.
The right wing and the opposition has learned from us. Richard Viguerie, in fact, who's a direct mail wizard of the right wing, said he did learn from us. He learned from us in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and seeing how people organize both locally and in movements.
Ralph Reed. I'm sorry, go ahead, Heather. Excuse me.
Heather,
so we face a fierce opposition that is more organized itself. But number two, we should also recognize we just had a great victory. It's not a final victory. The struggle continues, but it was a great victory, and it shows what we can do when we work together. And in some ways, this very series of panels on organizing, on labor unions and labor. There used to be a total divide, partly created by the Cold War. There was a divide, but also created by us not even knowing each other. And now as we are of the same people. So community, labor, and electoral, finding all the ways to put together, I think are part of the hope for where we go from here.
I'm going to let Hahrie have the last word. I know she wanted to get in.
I was just going to chime in on the question, but want to underscore, I think, what Maurice and others said is that I think we mistake mobilizing for organizing, and we mistake attention for commitment. And I think the currency of value in social change and building power is really commitment. But it's easy in the world that we live in to think that attention is a replacement for that. And so I think that's one challenge. And sort of one example that I'll just give of that is that there's been some research by some scholars at Vanderbilt that looked at this question of recruitment and this question of what are the factors that are most predictive of whether or not people stay involved in an organization or stay involved in a movement over time. And it's not demographics, it's not things like free time. In fact, it's things like whether or not they have an early experience of being able to query power, right? Do they have an experience of, even if it's a local city official, and asking someone like, how do you make decisions about when you put stop signs in or something like that? If you give people the experience of seeing that they can have a conversation with people in positions of power, that's more predictive of whether or not people are going to stay involved than anything else. And so this question of, if we're going to replace the 10,000 person Twitter mob relative to those kind of experiences of organizing, then we're not going to have the kind of sticky organizations that we need to build the kind of countervailing power that can combat inequality.
Well, we are out of time. On that note, I want to thank all of you very much for joining us today. Maurice Mitchell, Hahrie Han, Ernesto Corte, Deepak Bhargava, and Heather Booth. Thank you again. To find out more about organizing, please go to prospect.org/organize. If you have a story idea about a major challenge facing organizers and mobilization, contact us at the magazine at events@prospect.org. And I just want to alert you before we close that the forum will continue in about 10 minutes at approximately 2:20 p.m. Eastern. With our second panel, Organizing Workers, New Opportunities, Strategies, and Obstacles with Editor-in-Chief Howard Meyerson. We're going to take a short break, but we'll be back in about 10 minutes or so.
Well, welcome to the American Prospects Conference on Organizing Part 2. Part 2 is about perhaps the form of organizing with which one word is most connected, and that is labor. Organizing workers has long been perhaps the key element in creating things like broadly shared prosperity, democracy, lots of the things we value very much. That said, it hasn't been going all that well in recent years. I think of it as the 1/10 problem. By that I mean that the recent polling from Gallup and Pew show a record level of approval rating of support for unions in the United States, with identical levels of approval of 65%, which is way over the level of approval for most other American institutions. And yet, 1/10 of that figure, 6.4%, is the percentage of private sector workers who are actually organized into unions. So if that isn't a what's wrong with this picture, I don't know what is. We're going to be talking today to a range of people, ranging from on-the-ground organizers who can tell us a great deal about our situation and obstacles and opportunities and strategies going forward if American workers are to once again regain some of the power that they had when unions were more powerful. We're going to be talking to some people who still are part of organizing efforts in unions that have retained some power. And we're going to be talking to some strategists with interesting experiences and provocative ideas as to how we go beyond the current trough in worker power in the United States and escape that trough and go to a level where workers do again exercise a significant share of power. Do we yet have Charisse with us?
Charisse should be with us shortly.
Okay, well, I was going to start with Charisse, but I'm not going to start with Charisse. I will introduce each of our panelists just before their presentations. So I want to start this afternoon Eastern time, with Lauren Jacobs, who is the executive director of the Partnership for Working Families. It's an organization that began a number of years ago when a number of local organizations that were working to get living wages in their communities decided they should probably pool some resources and have a strategic center. And Lauren Jacobs, after considerable time as an organizer herself in many union efforts, has been for some time now the executive director of the Partnership for Working Families. And there, Lauren, you have worked on what kind of strategies to build worker power that your affiliated organizations working both by themselves and with other groups can do. So with that, Lauren, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Harold, and thank you everybody involved in convening this great conference. And I'm also really excited to hear thoughts from my co-presenters this afternoon. It's sort of a treat to be with this crew. So as Harold said, yes, it's the Partnership for Working Families. We grew out of the living wage campaign in California. Initially, we're called the California Partnership for Working Families, sort of as regional strategies grew, both on bringing together community and labor to fight for improved standards for workers, then figuring out ways to leverage public dollar investment and development to think about how to both create high job standards and construction jobs and permanent jobs that would take place on those work sites, but also thinking about how to at the same time win benefits for community. That then also grew into work that we've worked on with several of our affiliates, both around ports organizing and goods organizing, as well as looking at the trash industry and really commercial trash, and which is the privatized sector of the trash industry in most cities. Like the city doesn't sort of govern that in terms of commercial waste, and thinking about ways to both address health and safety conditions and at the same time find pathways. So and can also talk about whole regional strategies like working partnerships. Our affiliate in Silicon Valley has taken on with its campaign to raise standards for subcontracted workers in that region, which has resulted in creating a pathway for 5,000 workers to organize. It's all fabulous. We remain dedicated to doing that. But I think the real question of the day for all of us who have been at this for a long time is, what are the conditions we need to sow that enable a big surge in labor organizing? Like, we both need to be doing some of this work that is about sort of the hard grind of, you know, unit here, the city here, and this, but how is it starting to add up to conditions that enable the sort of mass surge in organizing we saw in the post-World War II period? How are we sort of creating conditions that enable that? I want to sort of pose some things that it might be questions that we need to be asking ourselves. And one is, I think we need to be thinking a little bit about, you know, capital and capitalism is dynamic. It shifts, it adapts, and it is very good at reinventing itself. What is sort of the current state of play in terms of when we look at how capital is organized? How is that? And do we have sort of the organizations and alliances to sort of fit the nature of the beast that we're trying to tame? And I would throw and say, I have an opinion on this because it's part of why we've been so involved with the coalition Athena, which we helped to co-found, is that I do think we're dealing with an era in which we can't think about that it is just enough to organize just the workers within a company, but that we do in order to deal with sort of the 24-hour life cycle of working people need to be thinking about all the ways in which corporations are touching and affecting people's lives. I think it's both sort of how we sow the conditions for a huge lift of the community of people as a mass demanding raised job standards. But I also think that this is also about how we are going to be able to right size ourselves to fit the corporations that we're fighting. So that looks like dealing with issues around environmental racism and pollution that is poured into communities of color with logistics hubs, or where industrial manufacturing happens and how it occurs. It is dealing with issues around how are either the products or services that are being developed affecting communities. So in the case of Amazon, thinking about, they also have a large wing that does basically neighborhood surveillance. These doorbells that have cameras affixed to them that are talked to the police department. How are we creating a condition in which the folks in the neighborhoods that are concerned about increased surveillance of every activity that they're doing are tied to the fate of workers in the logistics warehouses, right? And so I do think that this is about a moment of thinking about how are we dreaming bigger about a massive movement of community and labor. Yes, I work at the right organization for that, for thinking about that question, but how are we thinking about that as one of the sort of preconditions we need to sow? As well as, I think, really investing in how we're growing massively the new next level of leaders and just basic organizers that are going to be up to the challenge of moving quickly to talk to millions and millions of workers and working people.
Thank you, Lauren, for giving us a lot of interesting ideas and questions about how the heck we can move forward with basically trying to build a larger playing field to combat very larger business interests. I want to go now to Charisse Raspberry, who is a longtime organizer with, I think, if people were asked, people who follow this sort of thing, to identify perhaps the most remarkable private sector union, local union that they could come up with, that's where Charisse has been working. That is the local 226 culinary workers, in other words, the local of Las Vegas hotel workers. A local that has grown over the years from a little over 10,000 to over 50,000. That's one thing. It has grown despite the fact that they are in a right to work state. And it is also, more recently, a local that has seen a huge percentage of their workers unemployed because the Las Vegas economy essentially shut down, and certainly the hotels and casinos did, for over a year. And so that is a test of what this local has been able to hold together. And they're still involved in the kind of fights. This is the one time when I think we'll get a sort of bit of an on-the-ground description, the kind of fights that go on in the private sector about unionization, and invariably employer resistance there too. So with that, please, Charisse, take it away.
Hi, yes. So as he stated, that my name is Charisse Raspberry, and I work at Culinary Local 226 for the last 15 years. I have spent 10 years on internal, and the last 5 years I've spent external organizing. Our internal team works with the casinos and our areas where we already have union contracts. And in Las Vegas, that's mainly the casino workers, the laundry workers, the airport workers, and we have a few small shops in other areas. Our external team is working on unionizing the non-union casinos inside Las Vegas. So the first thing I'll talk about is our internal team. As he stated, Harold, Nevada is a right to work state, but even though it's a right to work state, we sit at about 94% membership. And here at Local 226, we pride ourselves on being a rank and file union, meaning that almost everybody who's on staff at 226 have come out of the workforce, out of the shop, because nobody knows better how to make a bid and the issues that come along with being in housekeeping than a housekeeper. Nobody knows more about serving drinks than a cocktail waitress. And then inside the airport and the laundry, nobody knows better about their working conditions inside that plant than somebody who worked in there. So all of us have worked in the industry, so we can relate to our members when it comes to their issues inside. And we have roughly, before the pandemic, almost 60,000 members here that we actually represent. And when we talk to people about signing union cards, it's not like most of the time when you work in a state that's not right to work, you basically are told to sign a union card because it's part of your conditions to work there. But here at Culinary, we actually explain to the workers that signing a union card actually gives you power in bargaining. It keeps strong union contracts going. It's how we maintain getting this great healthcare we have. We have one of the best healthcare plans in the whole entire nation. We have a great representation. Our retirement benefits, so our members can retire in comfort and retire with dignity. So when you continue to get these great contracts, you're able to go to the workers and talk to them about all the great things that they have, how we've gotten it. We've been here for a very long time here. We're, over 85 years here in Las Vegas, strong, Vegas strong. So once you explain that to the workers, you tell the workers the truth, the workers will do the right thing. So that's how we maintain such a strong membership. We're inside our shops almost 6 days a week talking to workers. And then I'll briefly explain our external team. Our external team, we're organizing station casinos right now. That's currently our big campaign. It consists of 10 casinos and about 6,000 workers. The first thing we do on external is we build a committee on the inside to take responsibility for their workplace, to be our eyes and ears on the inside. And before we go public with the campaign, everything is kept confidential. It's confidential to protect the worker, to protect the campaign. And when we make the decision to go public, what we do is we meet with the workers and we explain to them what it means to go public, the responsibility of wearing a union button, their right to organize, letting them know that by law you have a right to organize. And we explain to them what they should say to their coworkers when they're getting them to sign a union card, which is you're signing a union card to be represented by Culinary Local 226 and also Bartenders 165. Here, because we have such great card check language, we weren't having a lot of elections. When we decided to do elections in 2015, we hadn't had an election here in over 20 years. We were always fighting to get card check neutrality language. So we fought with stations for a long time. And in 2015, our leadership looked at how strong our organization was and the laws that had changed, and we decided we should go ahead and do elections. And the first place we did our election at after 20 years was Trump Casino. And I'm proud to say that Trump Casino now has a union contract with union benefits. So yes, we kicked his butt here. And then in September of 2016, we had our first election at stations, and which we won that election by 67%. But then we followed that election up the following month with an election at Palace Station. So we did not win the election at Palace Station. We had 49% of the workers vote yes, but we knew leading up that the company had committed a ton of labor violations. They broke almost every single labor law you can think of. So we filed charges and the employer agreed to recognize the union in March. And then we followed up with elections at Green Valley, which we won by 78%, Palms, 83%, Sunset Fiesta Rancho, and then Red Rock, which is our current election that we had, which was over 1,300 workers. We did not win that election. We lost that election with 46% voting yes. But once again, the same thing that happened over at Palace Station happened over here. So we are now currently in court with them, and currently the National Labor Board has issued a complaint against station casinos with over 60 unfair labor practices. Probably the biggest labor lawsuit ever filed against a complaint issued against a single company in the history of the NLRB. So we are in court currently with that. In the last two, Texas Station and Santa Fe, the Labor Board also issued a complaint ordering them to come to the bargaining table and recognize culinary bartenders 12226 and bartenders 165.
All right. Well, I think,
Briefly.
yes. No, I understand, and we can get back into that in a little more detail later on in the discussion period. But I think your successes are, you know, terrific, and your having to go to court and things like that are emblematic of challenges that workers increasingly face when they encounter the kind of employer company resistance that is all too common, that the fact is almost across the board here in the United States, as the ability of labor law as something workers can rely on, you know, is let's say a sometime thing. Our next panelist deals with issues like the unreliability of labor law and how to liaison unions with other organizations so that workers can have allies to regain the kind of power that American workers have lost a great deal of in recent years. She is the assistant to the president of the American Federation of Teachers, dealing with union liaisons with other organizations and other constituencies as a way to build worker power and progressive power generally, and that is Michelle Ringuette. So Michelle, how do you see things?
It's great, thank you, Harold. And hi, everyone. It's actually kind of intimate being on a screen with, you know, a handful of people. So I want to just say thank you while I have you, because I was completely honored, a little bit perplexed to be invited to participate this. Those of you who know me, like, I'm not an organizer, I would never pretend to be. But I definitely, some of my best friends are organizers. My grandmother was an incredible organizer. She was worked in a sweatshop in the mills in Fall River and helped organize the International Ladies Garment Workers. And like much of what I learned was at her knee and understanding solidarity. And you never miss an opportunity to ask people to do something and to follow up and to praise people for what they're doing, which I sometimes like get moving so fast that like I forget that. So I want to say thank you to each of you because like this work, and particularly after the past year we've been in, after the last 4 years we've been in, and for those of you working with working people and the labor movement, understand that this is not just a 4-year problem that we had to survive, that this is the logical culmination of a multi-decade strategy where we are frequently outnumbered, out-resourced, out-strategized, right? And it becomes very hard to kind of bring people who are deliberately set apart from one another or divided around issues that we have real differences, but are used strategically to wedge against us. So you have been the ones who have connected the dots. So if anything, like I was trying to figure out how to describe what it is I do, since none of my 2 days ever look the same, but like what I'm an organizer of systems, strategies, and resources. And I try to figure out like how, with the incredible worker organization happening out there, how we actually can leverage the power that's inherent in when they collectivize their actions and demands, and how we make meaningful and lasting gains, right? Because otherwise, why are we doing it? And I don't mean simply through legislation or through politics, because like my family would be the first in line to tell you that solutions don't run through Washington, right? And that a number of the things that I dedicate my life to fight for seems a little bit removed from the reality of if they're going to be able to pay their bills, if they're going to lose their job in COVID, if they're going to be able to get their kid a fair education, if someone is going to like do something about the lead pipes that are like poisoning their kids in their communities. So, so thank you for organizing people. And I think to sort of we were supposed to think about the opportunities and challenges of this moment. So I'm going to try to do it in a really concrete way, because otherwise I can give you a whole bunch of I think statements. And I even had F's lined up, like people are fried and they're fractured and they're watching Netflix, right? Which means they've got their filter bubbles, but also like there's a fantasy world, which is way better than like the life a lot of people have had to live for the past year or longer. But I'm thinking in terms of the role of organized labor and workers who are collectivizing their power and their agency in this moment and how it's playing out, and what the opportunities of this like incredible period of disruption offers us. So initially I was thinking back to Red for Ed, right, which is a terrific precursor to what we've just been through in public education over the last year, as we have grappled with the reality of having to shutter school buildings, but did not stop providing education, just lost access to a number of students who didn't have the broadband they needed, or the safe supports at home, or the amount of devices needed for multiple kids in a family. Like, it's the problems. I could spend, oh, I've got 2 minutes left. Okay, so I could spend a very long time talking about this, but what I can tell you is the work that organizers did early on to demand full funding for public education so that we could have decent class size ratios and nurses in every school. It was that kind of connection between people that helped us get through this moment, which we're not through yet, but we have to get the schools back open. We have to address the developmental regression that we know our kids have experienced. We need to meet social and emotional needs. All of that is far more possible because of people who have been talking together in their real lives, in their workplaces, in their communities. And then our job on a national level has been to get them the resources they need for it. And let me tell you one more way in which it's critical at this moment, because this impacts all of us and all of our families. Some people don't realize AFT is the second largest nurses union in the country. I know my sisters and brothers at NNU experience the same thing. What happened in the American healthcare system as we dealt with the crisis of the pandemic? At a moment of absolute catastrophe, lots of standards and hard-won gains get thrown out the window because people need to be getting the care they need. So they fought for PPE. They fought to get stay on shift, covering, taking care of loved ones, finding iPads so people could say goodbye. But also during this period, nurses were told to go and use respirators they'd never been trained to do. Thinking particularly of a case in New Jersey where would have been fired under any other circumstances if they had operated that machinery. The healthcare profession, all of our workforce took risks, strained themselves, did things that made them acutely uncomfortable, going from room to room without adequate protective gear, risking exposure to other people, without having a union, without having a way to fight back. You better believe this becomes a moment as things begin to level out where corporate actors and privatizers who figured out there are faster, cheaper ways to do things if you don't, hold to the standards that we fought for, that is going to impact and hurt all of our families and communities.
All right, Frontline, Union of Frontline Workers in more than one different occupation. And we will get back to some of that in a little bit. Right now, I would like to go to Celeste Faison, who is a organizing director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance. And when the National Labor Relations Act was passed in 1935, there were a couple categories of workers who didn't gain collective bargaining rights, largely because in order to win the votes of racist Southern senators, they demanded their exclusion. Farm workers and domestic workers were the bulk of those left out. And if you had talked to anyone 15, 20 years ago, the thought of organizing domestic workers and winning things for them would have been imponderable. People would have no idea what you were talking about. But domestic workers have organized. They've won some significant victories without actually being able to become a union, but they've done some pretty remarkable stuff and have plans to go forward. So for that and other things, I want to turn to Celeste. Welcome, Celeste.
Hi, and thanks for having me, Harold. And hello to all my fellow panelists and comrades. And so my name is Celeste. I'm Director of Campaigns at NDWA. And at NDWA, we are working on behalf of domestic workers who make all work possible. They do the precious work of caring for our homes and our loved ones. And we organize to ensure that they are treated with dignity and respect. And Harold talked a little bit about what why domestic workers don't have basic protections. But I just want to ground that in the fact that those domestic workers then were Black folks, right? And the majority of the farm workers at that time were Black folks. And that idea that Black labor was valuable and should be paid at all was like an abominable idea, concept, right? And so that really has us in the predicament we're in, that this is grounded in a history of exclusion and systemic racism. And we're working to counteract that. We organize within home care, cleaning, and childcare. And over the course of the next 5 minutes, I'm going to share with you some of the ways that we've organized workers without, and innovative strategies we've used without being able to have an actual union. So there are 2.5 million workers, domestic workers, 5 million employers, and 5 million workplaces, because every domestic worker works in an individual workplace. And our goal is to make sure that every care and cleaning job has a living wage and benefits by 2030, and that we're building a multiracial democracy and a new economy as we go. And that means that we have to solve for structural racism that I was talking about, and then the practical challenges that we face is like we have a disaggregated workforce, meaning that each employee has a different employer. And so we have to solve for that. And we've been using strategies to do that. We organize workers around policy, voting, markets, and culture. And we use that organizing, we use 4 organizing vehicles in order to do that well. So one is political. So we're building up our electoral power. We're shaping policies to bring about change. 2, narrative. Domestic workers are everywhere, and that's an intentional strategy, rather, of making sure that we visibilize this workforce that because, again, Black people being in the back of the house, you should be not seen nor heard, that this narrative of visibilizing this workforce, especially because people live in it, are working in people's homes rather than going to a place. We want to be able to do that. And then we are building new economic models to set a fair vision, a vision for fair standards, rather. And then we're modeling democracy and leadership development in our own organization, how we would want to see that in other places. So one of the things, one of our main strategies is through policy. We've passed 10 state domestic worker bills, state domestic worker rights bills in the last 10 years. Most recently in Virginia and Philadelphia. And what's powerful about that is we've been able to organize in spite of more Republican and to fight austerity. And then within that, we've done we've instituted some really cool things. So one is a wage standard board so that our workers have the ability to negotiate directly with employers that's regulated through the state. And then we have portable benefits, which is a way to aggregate workers into an app that we created called Aaliyah. And then that way workers can, and employers can pay into that app to have paid time off. So we're not just thinking about the problem, but we're also problem solving for the solutions as well. And then the last thing I'll say is that we have a really, really robust political strategy where our C4, which is the entity that you use to do electoral work, is in 7 states. We worked really hard in states like Georgia, Arizona, North Carolina, and South Carolina to turn those states blue, and have been successful in a few of those. And I'll stop.
Very successful in Georgia last November and this January. We noticed that. And those are all, just particularly the organization and winning Domestic Worker Bill of Rights in states and cities are absolutely remarkable achievements. Our next panelist is a directed what may be the most storied and successful private sector unionization campaign of the last 30 years, that having been Justice for Janitors, organizing janitors in office buildings in the downtowns and suburbs too around the country, and then has been one of the most wide-ranging and provocative strategists working not just with unions, but with other organizations as well, developing issues and developing strategies. He can always be counted upon for some of the most provocative ideas, which sometimes seem completely out of the box, and 20 years later, people say, why didn't we do that earlier? And that is Steve Lerner, and we will go to Steve now.
Hi, everybody, and thank you, Harold. That was very kind. I know what you say when I'm not listening. But anyway, I've been thinking about what to add to this because everything people are saying is so right. And I guess I have 2 things going on in my head. One, I think we have the greatest opportunity in the history of my time in the labor movement to do mass organizing. If I was a sociologist on another planet and I was looking down at Earth and you would talk about the incredible concentration of wealth, the rage of billionaires, the pandemic profiteers who have gotten richer while essential workers' lives have been destroyed. You can go on, and I'm not going to do the whole list. There have never been conditions riper for organizing than now. And then the other part of me, and this is where I guess I'm provocative, thinks we could really blow it. Because so much of the labor movement, and I'm not saying this panel, I'm going to come back to that, is so beaten down and so hopeless that not only can they not rouse themselves to potentially take the risk and do the bold things to seize this moment, but in fact, I think are going to potentially seduce into really doing really little things. Meaning instead of because they're so desperate for members, they're so desperate to win anything, that instead of really saying, what do we have to do to change this country? They're in an incredibly narrow way going to say, how can I pick up some members? And so on the one hand, I have that incredible fear, but then when I listen to this panel, and I know everybody on it but Charisse, but obviously I know the work of your union incredibly well, I see what is building up as the new labor movement here. Because when you look at, and I assume, Harold, it's why you picked the panel, when you look at the work that Lauren's doing, because she's not just talking about workers and organizing, she's talking about democracy and racism and how we built, what kind of country we do. Over in AFT, they're talking not just about how teachers get paid better, but they're talking about how do we transform our schools and our communities and the full human being. And Celeste, obviously, the domestic workers are doing some of the most spectacular work in looking at the full lives of people and how we transition to a different economy. So I guess to me, that if our panel's called opportunities, strategies, and obstacles, the opportunities are unending. And I think we're starting to hear a lot about the different kind of strategies here. But I want to do some warning notes, and I don't want to be like Debbie Downer here, but I think some folks are getting themselves a little, are missing important things. So one, let's take sectoral bargaining. Everybody's discovered sectoral wage setting, but then become very confused. There's a big difference between lifting wages by a sector by aligning with your employer so that they can raise prices and screw people, than sectoral bargaining, which is about workers having the power to improve their own lives, but also to challenge what employers are doing that's bad. There's a big difference between those who think the total mission of the labor movement is to get a raise and those who think the labor movement needs about transformational change. and how we're really building and defending democracy and creating the kind of world we want. And so I guess my big takeaway is I don't think we're going to have this moment again in the near future. And we need to think about what are the strategies and tactics. A lot of, Lauren talked a lot about this in the front end, that build the kind of movement that both increases power for workers, but defends, protects, and ensures that we have a democratic country here. Because and I guess the key thing I say about that is we will not have democracy without unions, but you can have unions without democracy. Meaning there are unions, and I'll give a specific example. Somebody recently proposed that the deal labor should make with Amazon is that they wouldn't challenge Amazon as monopoly if Amazon agreed to be union. And that's very seductive. Biggest employer in the world might agree to be union, but what you're agreeing is that Jeff Bezos can run the world. And so I think there's going to be very hard things that we have to challenge each other on, because if we don't, what we're going to try to do is go to this simplistic idea, and I call it union good. That's the idea that if people are in the union, good things will happen. But if we look back in the past, a lot of people were in the unions in the 60s and 70s, and we were on the wrong side of a lot of issues, which in fact set up our decline. So I guess what I want to challenge folks to think about is how are we building a movement that's about being transformational? How are we challenging capitalism? How are we saying that when you join the union, you simultaneously are trying to make your workplace better, but you're trying to make all of our communities better? And I think the lesson of the last 30 years is business union, bread and butter unionism, stick to the simple, make it a little better at work, failed miserably. And I want to go back, Harold, to what you said at the beginning in my remaining time. You pointed out this incredible contradiction, which is the vast majority of people say they want to be in a union, but when they try to organize, they often vote no, or they give up because the system's so screwed up. And I think part of that contradiction is because we haven't showed that we know how to win. We haven't had a path where workers say that the risk of organizing is worth it. And we're not going to do that just by technocratically having a better rap or being better at the doors. I'd go back to where Lauren ended, that we need to be about how we're transforming the country, and workers see joining the union and organizing as part of creating the kind of society they want at work and in their communities. And I guess I would, a lot of what I do now is we do something called bargaining and organizing for the common good. And I would build that out and say, what we're saying is workers have full lives, our communities have full lives. And if we don't address all of that, why would workers risk their livelihood to join a union who's really saying the best we're going to do is get a little bit more money while all these terrible things happen? So I'm not against getting raises. I'm all for that. I'm just saying the boss wants us to limit ourselves and narrow ourselves to just saying it's just about money. And I think what people hope and are desiring and are looking for is a vision and an excitement about a world we can create. The world is literally burning. And I'll just give three final things. One, incredible opportunity in Amazon. I won't say more as long as we don't get sued. Second, the auto industry is going to go electric. This is an opportunity for us to simultaneously say, we're going to save the environment, we're going to save the planet, and we're going to make these good union jobs. There is an opportunity to do that. Shame on us if we blow it. And just finally on banks, Bank of America just lifted its wage rate to $25 an hour minimum. It was $15 a few years ago. And in the bank worker organizing campaign, the critical thing is the campaign saying, yes, we want to be paid and treated decently, but as workers, we do not want to cheat people as a condition of employment. And so bank workers are doing something called regulating below. It was bank workers that turned Wells Fargo in for cheating. So I guess my end is, I don't think workers will organize unless they see this as part of changing their and their families' lives and communities. This is a moment we can do something extraordinary, and shame on us if we don't.
All right. Well, there are a lot of excellent ideas and experiences that our panelists have put before us. And Stephen has done a good job of connecting some of them. When he's talking about bargaining for the common good, that gets to Michelle's reference to Red for Ed, where teachers won the support of the public and even Republican governments to a degree when they went out on these strikes in states where they often didn't have collective bargaining rights, demanding not simply better terms for wages and hours, but for better funding of the schools and getting the parents of the school children on their side. And that's what turned a number of otherwise austerity besotted legislatures and such into granting some of these demands. And that relates to what Lauren was saying about, things like the Athena Coalition and sort of trying to get, the kind of synergy that Steve was just talking about between consumers, citizens, and unions, all in this larger mission of social transformation, of which unions have sometimes been a part, and as Stephen acknowledged, sometimes not. So I'm wondering if Lauren and then maybe Michelle and whoever could weigh in on expanding the definition of what a union does, and expanding the notion of who's walking with us on the line and whose lines are we also walking on, that sort of thing. So maybe beginning with Lauren and Michelle, and then Charisse and Celeste as well, as to this sort of expansive vision of what unions can and should do.
Yeah, thank you, Harold, and it's a fabulous question. I think, and thank you all of the fellow panelists. It was just a lot of brilliance and also awesome work, and I'm just sort of digesting a lot of what was just shared by everybody in the first round. But in response to this question around, sort of expanding, like, what does this mean, and what are the implications for what does it mean to be in a union? I really do think that, I'm sort of anti-nostalgia, and in this case, I'm actually going to say a little bit about, like, we do have done this as a movement, right? When we think about major breakthroughs, those are major surges, or the sort of campaigns that we sort of look to the past and say, that was amazing, like the Flint sit-down strike, or, I too worked on Justice for Janitors, and just think about how those surges or those uprisings happen amongst workers. They were connected to the community. It wasn't just, in sort of the fights and strikes I got to participate on. And it wasn't just like, well, these janitors in these select buildings in these select regions. It was the entire Latinx community. It was low wage workers. It was full neighborhoods saying, this is our struggle as a group, and connecting the conditions to what was happening in the community. So I think we've seen the seeds here. I think the point, though, is that and I don't want to sort of specifically say Amazon, because the other thing I don't even like keep saying Amazon. I just want to say it's a symbol of where things are going. It's not that they're especially bad. This is a company that's transforming in a way that we're going to see a lot of directions going. It's just the nature of what's happening is that because of how monopolies are being built out now, they're not the sort of same sort of, I'm the steel monopoly. They're now like, I'm the steel and the Hollywood and the phone company and your whatever else, right? Monopoly, that we need to as well be giving birth and life to. I think this is really the work of organizing, of helping people to see their own possibilities and their own sort of ability to be historical actors and changing things, but giving people full birth to really tackle the companies in all the ways that they're affecting their lives. Because I would say, I know in my own neighborhood where it got my own neighborhood here in Philadelphia, which got flyered with "Come work for Amazon" cards when they opened up a warehouse in Jersey, is also dotted with Ring doorbells. Right. It's also, it's a Black neighborhood that's gentrifying. So it's just thinking about, so I would say, how would you separate to a worker saying, well, let's just focus on getting you the $17 an hour and don't worry about the police, watching your kids hang out on the stoop. I mean, I think what we want to say is that both of those are worker issues, and those are all the domain of the union, and we can do it. We have done this. And so I do think it's like looking back to go forward.
I will note only that the news literally today is that Amazon is buying MGM, which has a huge film library. And I'll be damned if when I watch old movies, which I do all the time, I'm in some way enriching Jeff Bezos. I mean, Michelle, you guys did, kind of walked into this whole situation of bargaining for the common good with the massive teacher strikes of a couple years ago. What are your thoughts on how to be this labor can be this more expansive entity that deals with a range of people's values that don't like the plutocracy we are in?
So I will say I am enormously lucky. I work for a leader, and Randy Weingarten, who is fully committed toward using all of her power and resources to make meaningful change, lasting good for working people. My union is filled with leaders who understand that when you entrust and engage the members, like, people are capable of achieving extraordinary things. So right now, we are working to figure out how we're reaching the vaccine hesitant or those folks who just aren't online. We are trying to be that force to reach communities and not make the assumption that people are following some app on a phone to get their vaccine, right? In Chicago, part of reopening the schools, the high schools a few months back, was literally about making sure that the hard-hit communities could actually have access to the vaccines because they weren't sort of having the same ease of access. And right now we're trying to figure out how we're gonna make sure broadband gets out to folks and how we get the schools opened. And at the same time, and I have to give a nod to Unite Here and the domestic workers, both of whom are extraordinary partners on every front, but very specifically, the work that our unions have done together with our progressive allies and civil society and academics and everyone who recognized the real threat of the moment we're in, and who, frankly, we have been fighting fascism, and then we have been fighting an attempted violent overthrow of a government by rejecting the results of the election. And it was scary. And even as decimated as Unite Here was in the pandemic, and the sector has been hit so hard, there has been no better ally showing up, bringing its forces to knock on doors, now to be fighting for the People Act, right? And for voting rights. That these unions are invested not only in the rewards to our members and stabilizing the workforce, which is a good for everyone, but literally the transformational actions that are going to help make this a better, safer, and more just country that we have always told ourselves that we want to be.
Okay. Charisse, it occurs to me that your local is a huge deal within the larger community you're in, Las Vegas. And, there have to be all kinds of connections that your union has with the, building a larger thing, as it were. And I'm not even going to bother to define thing. Building a larger thing, consciousness or whatever, in Las Vegas. I know the Culinary Academy, the school that you've set up for educating people in the kinds of things they need to either enter or advance in the hotel casino industry is one part of that. But talk about your relationship with sort of a larger movement in a city where your union plays such a large part.
Yes. Okay. So once again, I didn't get a chance to thank everyone on this panel and also take a chance to say, I'm honored to be part of this. But yes, here in Las Vegas, the question you're asking about the unions being, basically more than just representing workers, getting wages for workers, being part of the community. I can tell you that, the governor here shut everything down from March 18th to June 4th. And with the majority of the industry being casino workers here, our unemployment department took a very hard hit. So part of what we did was we had our office staff trained with unemployment to help people fill out unemployment claims. We were working, actually our staff was working 10, 12 hours a day to make sure that not just our members, but the Las Vegas Valley as a whole was able to get their unemployment so people can feed their family. At our training academy that you're talking about, where workers can go to be trained to become cooks and bartenders, kitchen workers, bakers, and all of that. We turned that into a food bank where we were feeding the community. We gave out over 235,000 food baskets during this pandemic, our local here. So we are out in the community, and that's what it takes. It's not just representing workers. It's not just getting raises for workers. You need to be part of the community. They need to feel that you care about them at home and in the workplace. And when the casinos opened up, we're the ones who fought and passed the law to make sure that workers came back with PPE equipment. We're the ones who fought to pass the law to make sure, because when they opened, the workers had masks on, but the customers who were coming in didn't have masks. So we said, wait a minute, you have to protect the workers, to protect the community. We still had people coming here, driving here from all over the country, but yet there was no safety protocol put in place. So we took on that fight. So we're in a community on a regular basis during the pandemic, more visible than ever before, but also, you know, like you said, with the training academy and working with the non-union casino workers. If we get a victory, it helps for the whole entire Las Vegas area, whether you're union or not. If we get tip allocation lowered, you know, in 2009 during the recession, it was lowered for everybody. It didn't matter whether you were union or non-union, everybody benefited from that. So.
Okay, I know I'm struck by the fact that there's a system of unions in a couple other countries called the Ghent system, which is named after a city in Belgium, where the unions are able to actually administer certain governmental benefits like unemployment insurance. It seems to me you guys just did that in Las Vegas, and you know, there should be some way, not only there should be one way that happens, not simply on an ad hoc basis. I want to go for a minute to Celeste, who I know has had some experience with the interface between their own alliance of domestic workers and a whole larger community of which, you know, they have organized some, but they're really kind of representative of whole, you know, thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions more people. So Celeste, you want to talk about that for a minute?
Yeah. So, you know, we don't live single issue lives. I think Patricia Hill Collins said that. We live intersectional lives, and our members are representative of that. And so this idea of bargaining for the common good is kind of embedded into our strategy. So one of the things that we have, one of our programs is Families Belong Together, where it's just focused on uniting folks at the border. And then we have We Belong Together, which is a larger coalition focused on moving immigration, which directly affects our members, but is also just a part of our values and being able to leverage the collective power of domestic workers to move that legislation forward. Other ways that we've done that is we have a program called We Dream in Black, which is our organizing leadership development mechanism for Black workers. And they have this beautiful agenda called Unbossed. That's really intersectional. It lists things from housing, policing, schools, education, as all really important issues that need to be on the agenda for domestic worker organizing. And then lastly, I think one of the pieces of organizing, you know, the Alinsky model used to say like social service is this and organizing is this, and understanding that our new organizing models have to blend the two, right? So that's making sure that people have vaccines, making sure that we are fighting on behalf of essential workers to make sure that folks have benefits and are being protected, and then standing up vehicles to get those. So we gave out, I think, close to $40 million in COVID relief money to domestic workers, because that service element is really important. And then the last thing that I'll close with here that's really that is active right now is that we have a campaign to get $400 billion for HCBS in a jobs plan for home care workers. And the way that one of our main strategies is to leverage other movements. So for instance, paid leave, childcare, disability rights and home care workers are all getting together and saying that care is important. And I think that level of coalition building is really necessary towards winning in this new environment that we're in.
Okay, I want to quickly go to Stephen, and then we'll take questions from the people viewing this. Stephen, how does all of this intentionality to sort of broaden what unions do, take us from there to building worker power?
In 30 seconds?
Or 15 if needs be.
Well, in a way, if you listen to what folks said, that's the description of how we start to build worker power, because we're describing, and I think it's so exciting that it's a theme here, that people live many different lives, and that when you combine those things, that's how we build the alignment and the excitement that keeps people involved and lets us organize. So I guess when I think about work, let me give two quick examples. Maybe in New York recently, they won $2.1 billion for undocumented workers, and it was an out of the state budget, because these are all the workers that couldn't get unemployment, et cetera. And those workers went on a 3-week hunger strike. They demonstrated the incredible power that workers could demonstrate, and they won $2.1 billion, unheard of, openly saying this is for excluded and undocumented workers. And the other example I'd give is in Connecticut, where 1199 New England has been negotiating new contracts and has a huge bargaining for common good campaign. In the nursing homes, not only did they raise the minimum wage for nurses' aides from $12 and $13 to $20 an hour, but they've also are campaigning to close prisons, hire more social workers. The campaign demands in Connecticut are about transforming that state, taxing the rich, closing prisons, having social workers, mobile units, dealing with racism. And what you're seeing there is Governor Lamont started a month ago saying, I'm calling out the National Guard to break the strike, literally. He didn't say to break it, he said to assist, whatever the hell that means. But in a week, he went from that to Mr. Austerity agreeing to putting hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars into workers' pay and into the communities that those workers are servicing. So to me, those are examples of what's possible. And when we layer together the work everybody's describing here, that begins to be a roadmap for the kind of work we need to build the kind of movement we need.
Okay, I'm gonna go to some questions now that people who are watching have posed. One of these questions is obviously all of the organizations that you're either represent or that you're talking about use technology, use social media as a way to get people engaged. That seems to be something that reaches a particular audience, but oftentimes it doesn't reach the audiences you really need to reach. Is there a danger of over-reliance on social media? And social media can create a kind of form of engagement. It doesn't necessarily create the kind of engagement you really need to go forward. So any thoughts on that from anyone?
I'll jump in here. For someone whose work and members are very focused on in-person, like it is a constant reminder of the power of what happens when you get people together in a room together, something that too few of us have been able to do over the past year. And I do see around us that lots of organizers, it has, we had problems with collectivism for a while, that it becomes a new tool. Everyone relies so heavily on it to the exclusion of other things. But this sort of harkens back to the point I was making before just on vaccine hesitancy, like the reality that there are assumptions being made every time you think you're reaching people through devices, or that somehow it's real engagement if you can get them to click like. And two, I'm not saying we should abandon these tools, but they are tools that serve us. They cannot be the center of our strategy.
Okay, any other thoughts on the virtues and limitations of that kind of
yeah, well, I would actually argue differently. So in COVID, social media has been a life force for us. And so we, especially with having a disaggregated workforce, getting into those nanny groups on Facebook. We have a bot, which has allowed us to identify hundreds of house cleaners that are Spanish speaking that we would have never touched. Now there is a thing of like, it's not social media. We have to think of the pathway of once we get that, how do we bring them into the universe and move them towards membership? But WhatsApp, social media have all been really critical pieces and have been tools that our members have been excited about in terms of being able to be in community with each other because they are isolated, and being able to organize other people into their movement.
So I'm going to ask you a particular question. The last year has also seen the remarkable outpouring of support and involvement in Black Lives Matter. And to what extent have the domestic workers been part of that, organized with that, yourselves, maybe internally? Because I mean, this is what's going on in the broader society, in a society in which most of your members, many of your members fit. So what's been the interaction there, and how is that related to what the Domestic Workers Alliance has been doing?
So one of the things that we've been really intentional about since about 2013 is creating space for Black workers in the organization and doing some real solidarity work between other populations of domestic workers to understand Black issues, vice versa, right? So when the uprisings happen, we've already done the political work amongst our members and our members are actually giving us the directive to get involved. We're a part of the movement for Black Lives. We're a member organization, and then many of our chapter leaders, of our chapter directors and our members have been on the ground protesting and then working on things like Mama's Bailout, which is an initiative to bail Black mamas out around Mother's Day and other issues of that. And so our members are naturally connected to BLM, and we work really hard within the organization to principally support the movement and to be on the right side politically, like to walk our talk. And our staff holds us accountable to that as well.
All right. There has been also a lot of unionizing going on among workers who can't easily be laid off, and among young workers who, the political consciousness of the young these days isn't what it was. It's decidedly to the left of where it was 20 years ago and 30 years ago. And, we've seen unionizations going on universities, in nonprofits, in the media, where Lord knows reporters and photographers are at publications which themselves are often endangered species. How much of this real pro-union sentiment among the young, can lead to real change in a movement, much of which is still not young and not woke, and really quite distanced oftentimes from the political and economic perceptions of 25-year-olds. So anyone want to take that? Or are you all too old to answer that? No.
That's what I was going to say. Like the oldest guy in the call probably isn't the one who should answer this one. Though I do have adult children, so I could call them.
Okay, well, but as
if nobody wants to say anything, I'll throw something out. But
okay.
I have one thing to throw out. I just think, I think there's a couple of things about just because I think we have a way of what arises in our brain when we say the labor movement.
Right.
And I notice this all the time in talking with folks about who comes to mind. And I would say that I think we have to think about the labor movement as every instance in which collections of workers and working people are rising up together to demand justice and and equity. And that is, and I would say BLM is a working class movement. And I think that debate has gone on, has raged, talking about social media incessantly. And it's crazy to me because I'm just like, I don't think Black elites are facing the same issues with surveillance and over policing. So if we're really going to talk about what are the communities that are facing that, those are communities in which Black and brown working people are living. So it is that. And I do think this, the rampant organizing that's happening in media, that's both on digital and print, is fabulous. And that is the labor movement. I think it is really like, it's a problem that what doesn't come to mind is the teachers in Arizona when we say the labor movement, or the domestic workers. Like, people think of like people, big men welding iron still. And I think that's, I would say to your point, Harold, is like, young people are already transforming the labor movement because they're building this next era. So it is in formation. I know there's a question about who's sitting atop a lot of the institutions, and that's a different question. But in terms of, sort of bringing the fire that has the hope that Stephen talked about earlier, like, they're doing it. And the choice to some of us old heads, because I now get to join that gang, is whether or not we're willing to take leadership from young people. And I think that I'm amazed at how much smarter they are now than I was at their age. So
and Harold, I can tell you that getting young people to the forefront of the labor movement is a task that our union has been taking on for several years now. Probably the whole entire time I've been at the union. We usually have to put a whole entire program together where we'll say, okay, for the next 2 months, every time you come back to check in, you have to have went and talked to a worker inside your shop that is.
Oh no.
Oh, Charisse, I think we lost Charisse there.
That
gets back to my question about technology.
Well, one thing I wanted to offer for young people is when we look at the organizing that's happening amongst gig workers, we have to credit a lot of that to young people. The organizing that's happening with Amazon, Uber, when we look at like the domestic workers that are using the apps, those are a lot more young people. And so I think young people are leading this gig worker organizing in a way that it might not be as visible, but they're definitely doing that, asking that question.
I would throw one other thing out.
We only have time for one last comment and then we have to go. So Stephen, if you can make it quick.
I'm going to make it quick. I was going to say, we've given young people a horrible world. They have massive student debt. Their incomes are down. It's the first generation that it's going to do worse than the parents. So if there's ever, when I talk about hope, if there's ever a generation that organically has a reason to want to change the world and organize, it's young folks. And that's my big fear in the labor movement. We should embrace, not chase them away. We've sort of failed, and we need to engage, involve, and take wisdom from the folks who are at the work, getting the worst of the society. And I think a key part of the movement, and incredibly excited about what we can do when we welcome folks instead of chasing them away.
Always good advice. We hope labor continues to welcome folks and can win some battles that will encourage more folks to join. And with that, I really want to thank our panel. I want to thank Charisse and Lauren and Michelle and Celeste and my friend Steve for joining us for what I think been really a terrific panel. So viewers we're going to take a little break. You'll be seeing a slideshow of famous organizing and workers and such, and then we'll move on to our third panel about electoral organizing. And if we only could create millions of Stacey Abrams, how much better we might be. And if you want to follow the Prospect on our future activities and articles on organizing, go to www.prospect.org/organize, and we will be there for you. So thanks again to the panelists, and thank you all.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm Bob Kuttner, one of the co-editors of the American Prospect. The subject of this panel is combining movement organizing and electoral organizing. And I think it's fair to say that movement organizing and electoral organizing has had an uneasy history. I did a piece on this a few issues ago called The Movement, the President, and the Party. And obviously, the situation with Biden standing between us and totalitarianism is not the typical situation. And a lot of the tensions between movement organizing and electoral organizing were damped down and still are. But if you go back in history, movement organizers have been somewhat ambivalent about at least some Democratic Party officials. I vividly remember as a very young activist at the 1964 Democratic Convention in Atlantic City, smuggling floor passes to the Mississippi Freedom Democrats. And there was a button in that era by Students for Democratic Society called Part of the Way with LBJ, which meant that it was a nice double meaning. We were partly with Lyndon Johnson, but his agenda didn't go far enough. And we certainly weren't with him on Vietnam. And also, the Democratic Party has a history of coming through our states and localities with a big vacuum cleaner and sucking out all the money and spending it on campaigns, sometimes at the expense of local organizing. And there are also tensions between progressives and the candidates in our states and localities that are promoted by the DCCC or the DSCC, that are sometimes not candidates that most people would support, that can't even manage to get elected. So I guess the question for this panel is, what are both the tensions and the opportunities, given the fact that there has been much less of the circular firing squad than usual on the progressive side because the stakes are so high. And we have just a terrific panel to kick that off. Georgia was the epicenter of just about everything. We are waiting for Nseu Fought. Is she on yet? I do not.
She is not on, but we are trying to get her on soon.
Okay, so we're trying to get her on. So let me go to our next speaker, Brian Kettering. And Brian has an amazing history, both as an organizer and now as a foundation leader. He's a director of the Economy and Society Initiative at the Hewlett Foundation. But before that, he was the co-executive director of the Center for Popular Democracy. So Brian, how does this look to you?
Thanks, Bob, for having me. And it's great to be here with Mike and Afia, and looking forward to seeing Nsé in a minute. So thanks for having me today. I mean, there's a lot of ways to come at the question, but since you were bringing up the historical record of the relationship between movements and organizing, I would sort of draw on a little bit of my own political genealogy and sort of bring it up to the present. Part of what I'm doing at the Hewlett Foundation actually is working on the question of neoliberalism and its dominance as our economic paradigm, and sort of connecting that to this conversation and to the first panel earlier today, where Ernie Cortez talked about the way neoliberalism was sort of showing up in communities, and he talked about NAFTA and its impact on workers and working communities, for example, in the first panel today. You know, there's a long tradition that, you know, the labor movement, for example, has always understood, or often historically, the importance of elections. I think Afia and Nsé and myself all work and have worked in the community organizing sector, which is, you know, one other piece of the movement sector. And I think there's been a complicated relationship with electoral work. You know, my work descended out of the ACORN tradition, which was very firmly understood really from its founding in 1970. And ACORN itself came out of the welfare rights movement in the late 60s. But from its inception, there was a evaluation of electoral strategies. And that was sort of a minority view, I think, in the 70s and 80s, and in that subsector. But I wasn't a part of this, but in 1980, there was a primary battle between Senator Kennedy and Jimmy Carter, and the progressives and a lot of the early Acorn organizers organized around sort of a modern day Warren or Bernie effort, if you will, within the Democratic Party. But there's a fascinating history where there was basically a battle over class representation within the Democratic Party that played out in around 1980. And the sort of story that was always passed down to me, I started organizing in 1994, was that we fought the battle within the party, we lost, because it marked a sort of neoliberal turn within the Democratic Party. And so that led to a whole generation of investment in the new party in the 90s, and then ultimately what became the Working Families Party in New York in 1998, and now nationally. That's just sort of one genealogy, but it's a really interesting story, and I've always valued sort of coming from that tradition. I think just one last point, and then jumping to the present, I think we have come light years as a sector. And yet, as you said, Bob, we're in a sort of perilous moment right now. So I think I'll just name two areas that I hope we can explore in this conversation. Mike and Afia are more expert at these things than I am, but one is there's tremendous innovation in the electoral practice space that I think is sort of bleeding over into movement and community organizing in really useful ways. Because historically, the pattern, at least in community organizing, was there was so much money for electoral work. And so there would be a lot of innovation, including around technology, that was happening there, but it didn't always transfer over into sort of the other, 10 months of the year outside of an election context. And I think that's changing and sort of has been accelerated by COVID. The second theme I would raise is there's historically been a bit of a divide between work on voting rights, which has been very litigation and policy oriented, and work on organizing and campaigning in elections. And I think 2020 blew that up. And obviously it's an existential question, the fate of our democracy in the period ahead. So, I have some further thoughts on that, but anyway, look forward to digging in on those two questions, among others. So.
Okay. I think we're still waiting for Ensei. Boy, I hope she gets on. Let's go next to Afia. Afia Adamensa is executive director of Community Voices Heard, and also serves as the board chair of People's Action Institute. And she has worked everywhere from Ghana in West Africa to various locales in the United States on fair and equitable housing, racial and social justice, and support for low-income families generally. So, Afia, over to you.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone, and hi, Brian and Michael. Thank you for having me on. Excited about this conversation, and Brian, I appreciate the way you got us started, right, with a bit of like a historical understanding of kind of how we're coming to be. And I think, just thinking kind of how Robert started, for me, when I think about the merger of like the body politic with organizing, for Community Voices Heard, we similarly, as Acorn, started as a welfare rights organization, right? Heavily Black and Latinx, mostly Puerto Rican women in Harlem and the Bronx. And coming into politics for us in our 27-year history was just in the last 10 years, right? With the understanding, I'm sorry, one minute. Sorry. With the understanding, right, that for a long time we've been left out of politics because of some of those class issues that Brian raised, right? With the understanding that if particularly Blacks and Latinos were coming into politics, it was what would be considered the best of us, right? How are we coming in? How are we entering in that moment? And so for Black and Latino women who are on welfare, who are fighting for something crazy, calling rights for women who are on welfare, how and where we entered the body politic when it wasn't about respectability, when it wasn't about putting forward our best so that we could achieve, but a politics that was for all of us has been fraught and continues to be fraught. And so that's a starting point on issues of race and class and where we enter. But I would also add, as an organizer, a tension that continues, that we hope and lessens, is this idea of organizing around issues and movement and structures as opposed to organizing around individuals, particularly given that history tells us that we organize around folks, particularly I'd say for disenfranchised and targeted communities like Black and Latino, a lot of times it is that first person. And how do we move with people who can be held accountable and who may be our future targets, as opposed to being seen as deities, right? Saviors for a class of people, as opposed to a movement that is leaderful and accountable to folks. So those tensions remain, and something that we wrestle with to this day. But I think, to your point, Robert, because of the emergency of the moment, we've had to deal with the long term, and while still fighting in the interim to get to this better medium, right? As opposed to pouring in money in certain states at a certain time every year. How is every day, not an election day, but in a campaign to build a sustainable base that may or may not vote for people. We hope they do. A campaign that has friends and enemies that are not permanent, but goals that are clear and understandable. So I think that continues to be our attention, and something that I'm looking forward to grappling with and talking about with you all today.
Thank you. Mike Podhorser's official title is Senior Advisor to the President of the AFL-CIO, but of course we all know him as one of the most insightful thinkers and strategists in the broad progressive movement. So Michael, over to you. You're muted.
Here we go. Thank you. So I was thinking about what to say and how to like all of this, and thought that I'd start by like being really provocative, and go somewhere completely different. Donald Trump is the first movement president we've had in the United States, right? The movement for white lives elected him, right? What we saw was actually a movement taking over the country and exploiting our institution and election rules to do that, and revealing to us that essentially by being a majority of a minority, you can own the government, right? And, you know, there's a long history to it. When after the Voting Rights Act, the Republicans, which were basically the capitalist party against the Democrats, who were the Labor Party, began to appeal on the basis of racial dog whistling, law and order, all of that. And the capitalist part of the Republican Party felt everything was in control. They did the dog whistling, but basically just did their business. Especially after Obama, that part of the coalition, the Movement for White Lives, was done with it, right? And basically went all in on politics, right? That movement already had right-wing media. It already had white evangelical churches. It had paramilitary organizations. It's a full-blown movement. And it decided to own the Republican Party. And when you look at what's going on right now, like with Liz Cheney and this little division and all of that, and people are talking about why are the Republicans like really going and violating their norms and all of that, it misses the point. Since Obama was elected, 80% of the House Republican caucus has been elected. That is what, and 75% of the senators. All of the senators who objected to the Electoral College were elected after Obama. It was a rhino expulsion movement, right? The energy of the Tea Party in politics was to take advantage of what I started with, which is how you can sneak your way into power, right? That's how a movement uses politics. And of course, Trump was like nothing like an evangelical, nothing like a Christian. But in terms of their agenda, they got a lot, as we know, they got a lot of what they wanted, and they almost like made it, you know, again, right? To go back now, sort of on if that's the dark side of the coin, the brighter side of the coin was the decision of the labor movement in the 1930s to basically do the same thing with the Democratic Party. Although it was more complicated because the Democratic Party at the time was essentially the home of the segregationists from the South. But since, as I said, the Republicans were the capitalist party, that was where labor went, right? And so for the 30s, right? You got the Wagner Act, you got all of these things because you couldn't, because of the power that the labor movement had by being inside the Democratic Party, right? And it reflects an insight that both the labor movement had then and that the movement for white lives has right now, that it's an illusion to think that there is party other than the winner of the battle of interests inside of it, right? There's not an address for either party that you can say, oh, you better do this. It's a game of like pure power competition and who brings resources and who elects people to office, right? And that's like the only way movements actually translate their programs into power and big societal change, transformative changes over the long term. You take it over and you govern. And of course, that means making some compromises that you don't like and all of those kind of things, but it works. It's the only thing that works. You look at other movements that never got their full programs, whether it's the populists or others, it was because they sort of took a posture that was, we're not political, we just have an agenda, right? But we're playing a game that requires you to do that. No way around it. It is the same thing like at the state and local level. And you can do the same thing there. And so I think, so to wrap up, right, I think that maybe to pick up on what Brian was saying about the 1980 primary fight between Carter and Kennedy, a big part of the reason that we got to that point, right, was that up through 1968, you couldn't get the Democratic nomination without labor support, right? And when Nixon got elected in arguably not a great move, the labor movement basically, and because Nixon made a lot of overtures and was giving stuff away to the labor movement said, hey, we can do business with both sides for the first time in a long time. And that started like a withdrawal from being the party to being somewhat outside the party and losing a huge amount of steam and power. And so then Carter gets in because the rules get changed in a way that take away power from labor to decide who the nominee is. And then like we're scrambling after Carter destroys us. Anyway, that's 6 minutes, so I'll stop there.
Michael, I want to come back to that because I've done a lot of work on this myself. But first, Ensei has joined us, and Georgia, of course, was ground zero of all of this. Ensei Ufot is the chief executive officer of the New Georgia Project, which was founded in 2013 by Stacey Abrams, and which in the last election, or between 2013 and the last election, registered 500,000 Georgians to vote. And then in the cliffhanger special election of January 2021, which determined the US Senate and Biden's ability to govern at all, the New Georgia Project mobilized volunteers to knock on some 2 million doors. So it's a real pleasure to have you with us, and say welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Georgia, super happy to be here with you all today. Thank you for extending the invitation. I think that, I am an organizer, and yes, we have registered now well over 500,000 young people and people of color in all 159 of Georgia's counties in the 9-week the 9 weeks between the November general election and the January runoff, we knocked on 2 million doors and made over 7 million phone calls and sent over 4 million text messages and had the best creative that was available to Georgians, period. And it resulted in the election of Georgia's first African-American United States Senator and Georgia's first Jewish US Senator. And I'm particularly proud of the work that we did to not only elect NGP's former board chair to the US Senate, but to send our 33-year-old senator to DC to do the people's work. And it's particularly notable for us because it's super clear to our members in our base that well over half of the Senate was born before there were even 50 states. And so when we talk about our electoral organizing and our electoral work, I think people are often shocked to hear me say that I actually don't really care about voting outside of its ability for us to elect officials who will co-govern with the people, people that we can send to Atlanta and that we can send to Washington, DC to do the people's work. And that, you know, there are things that are pressing in the minds, in the lives of a lot of working families in Georgia. Our minimum wage is $5.15 an hour. It's below the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. There are 12 hospitals in rural Georgia that have already closed, or they're slated to close because the Republicans in Georgia have left billions of dollars on the table and refused to expand Medicaid. We're building 2 new nuclear power plants in African-American communities. There haven't been any new nuclear power plants built anywhere in the US in 30 years. There are so many things. You know, we are planning to return to traditional learning settings this fall, and many of the school boards in Georgia don't have anyone. The youngest person on the school board graduated from high school 25 years ago. And so we look to elect officials on the local level all the way up to the federal level who, one, know what our community's priorities are, and 2, who are accountable to our communities. And again, would rather, you know, would their number 1 priority is to get the job done on behalf of Georgia voters. And so that is why electoral organizing is part and parcel of our theory of change. And I think also that's why we've been really successful in sort of cutting through the noise. And what I mean by the noise is the noise of federally well-funded campaigns, the noise of conventional political wisdom that told national organizations and campaigns that Georgia wasn't a priority and that it wasn't a battleground state, the noise of misinformation and disinformation. We are clear that Black voters and young voters and folks who are new and unfamiliar with the political system are the number 1 targets for misinformation and disinformation. And so being able to establish ourselves as trusted messengers, known entities in the communities that we organize with, has helped us, again, make sure that our quality, fact-based messaging penetrates through the noise of this political moment that we're in. And as a result of that, we have seen the white lash that comes from January 6th. The dots connect between January 6th, between the 60 plus lawsuits that were filed by the Trump campaign, and not one single court in the country found that there was evidence of widespread voter fraud. And also the big lie that not only powered those 60 plus lawsuits, the big lie that powered the Capitol insurrection, where people broke into the Capitol, killed people, But it's also the big lie that's powered these 361 anti-voting bills that have been introduced in 47 states across the country, including our own in the state of Georgia. So, being able to sort of create the demand and sustain the demand for the kind of change that we want to see is, our raison d'etre, our reason for being, why we are here. We want to create a political home for Georgians, for young people, for people of color. And I would just add that much like our country, right, a lot has been written about the changing demographics in our country, that the browning of America, if you will. And I would argue that nowhere is that demographic shift happening more aggressively and more acutely than across the Sun Belt or across the Black Belt, across the South and the Southwest. Georgia is going to be the first state in the Deep South with a white minority. So people of color are going to make up the majority of Georgians in like 4 years. And while we do not believe that demographics automatically equal destiny, it has given us an opportunity to, again, test out our theory of change, show that we can deliver the goods, not only for Georgians, but for 85% of American households who got their stimulus checks because of Senators Warnock and Senators Ossoff. And so 85% of American households have received some sort of relief from this new administration. And we're really proud of that. And we want to do more of it. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Let me try and draw together some of the themes that each of the speakers expressed and pose a question. So Democratic Party moved away from progressivism, moved away from the labor movement, still had unfinished business of racial justice. There's an interesting book by a young political scientist named Dan Schlossman called When the Movement Becomes the Party. And he's contrasting what happened on the Democratic side, where the movement had been the party, the labor movement, and then the party moves away from the movement, with what happened on the Republican side, where, much as Mike said, the movement takes over the party. Now, it would be a gross exaggeration to say that Trump has done us a favor. However, the stakes of making sure that we don't descend into outright fascism has forced all of us to get much more serious about coalition. And Biden has turned out to be somewhat more progressive than a lot of us feared, in part, I think, because of the circumstances that he inherited, but in part because he owes a lot to the progressive movement, that despite some qualms, progressive movement took about 1 nanosecond to decide that everybody had to go all out to get Biden elected to spare the country from outright fascism. So we have a moment that is ripe for coalescence if we maximize it. I guess my question is, what else might we be doing to maximize this moment and put back together labor organizing and organizing for racial justice and organizing for economic justice? What does this moment offer us? I pose that to anyone and everyone.
So,
no, go ahead. Go ahead. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I guess I would just offer. I'm sorry. Say again.
I said, Afia, please go ahead. And then...
Okay. So I would just pose a few things. So, Robert, I'd say in love, I'd push back on that slightly, just in that I think there were large swaths of us who've been about coalition, right? Because of the do not at all disagree with fascism, right? Definitely was a full-on possibility. But prior to that, just want to lift up that a lot of us were catching hell, right? And so coalition was always a mandate, given what folks were working against. But I think to your larger point, this moment provides space, I would say, for a lot of folks to rethink what was done before, right? So for labor organizing, for organizing of grassroots people and individuals, and to have people and organize institutions, I would say that this moment calls for a deep reckoning and coming with a humility of not just how do we go back to what we did or how do we get people organized, but what were the gaps in those organizations, right? What's a way to do this differently? Because old school organizing would say that, to Nsei's point, Georgia wasn't in play, that we should never put money in New York because what happens in New York doesn't matter, right? So given that people have shown with not just word, but in deed, that what was before is not today, right? A reckoning that requires a humility, but also one of like, how do we do this differently with an understanding in a different way that our fates are intertwined, right? Nsei mentioned that 85% of households have gotten some type of aid. Now, clearly, while demographics are changing, this is not a majority person of color country, right? So that lets us know that there were a whole bunch of white folks, I think the scientific term is a ton, got some type of stimulus that they would not have received but for this administration, right? So folks have shown that there is a difference depending on who's in office. How do we organize in a way that allows folks to understand that like it's okay to receive benefits, which forces us to tackle with issues of race, right? Issues of race interrupt people being okay with receiving things. That's what those people get because they're takers, right? So we have to do things differently and deal with some of those issues, or else people who rightfully need assistance in the midst of the greatest pandemic. I mean, we on this Zoom right now, right? Because we can't be together. So if a global pandemic, right, teetering in fascism doesn't force a different type of conversation within movement space, right? Labor movement, ideological movements, of seeing this as an opportunity that we must, right? I'm an organizer, so I believe in self-interest, right? There's no martyrs, right? I'm Catholic, but I'm not a nun. I move in my interest. So for the benefit of myself and my children, I need something to move differently, right? So that allows for a liberation, that allows for us to get free, allows for a body politic that works for all of us, means we have to do things differently. And so I would say it hopefully gives an opportunity for people to say things that they never like to say in public, right? We're taping this, that they may have gotten something wrong, that maybe I can learn something from Brian can learn something from me, right? And that maybe we need to rejigger this thing a little bit. So I think we can't underestimate that type of space of being willing to try something new while also being guided by at times an unshakable faith that folks have told me that this state doesn't mean anything. They said that working on local politics isn't going to happen. They said that building a base isn't real. Some things we know are wrong and we need to work with and to build those bases. But I would also say it's an opportunity for us to think through, like, what are the guiding things that we know we need to see happen to sustain power? I think a lot of times we don't talk about power. We've made it a dirty word, right? Like, people move to things because there's power in it. Now, organizationally, people's action, community voices heard, and I know Nsei and Brian share this, there's an idea about power right, in love. And so I'd say that our adversaries, while doing dastardly things, I have a respect on their clarity on power, right? Their organizational clarity is around getting power, maintaining power. And a lot of that, 99% of it has negative consequences for people who look like me in this world, but they're clear on it. I want us to have the type of clarity on how we have power in a sustainable way that shows that things can be different, where people can get things if they need them, right? Where there's a actual democracy that's real in deed and not just in word and in books. And so how do we orchestrate unapologetically for power that makes people feel powerful, right? Instead of hopeless, instead of without dignity, instead of without sustainability. And to do that with a humility, a clarity, and a sense of urgency, because as I said before, a lot of our communities were catching hell. And sadly, I think in the midst of COVID, we are unified, right? With 500,000 people dead, many who didn't have to be, with all of our institutions hemorrhaging and showing some lies that were held together by glue and fairy tales, that a lot of these things aren't working. So I hope that this moment gives urgency, humility, and a sense for wanting to roll up our sleeves and think about how we do this better.
Great, thank you. Mike?
Oh, yeah, so I think one thing that I just want to clarify in this conversation is that movement and elections is in the United States kind of too broad a way of thinking about it, because we've mostly been talking about the national elections. And we can keep doing that. But I think sort of what we should be doing, your original question about how to seize the moment and all of that, right? There's lots of, there are different kinds of strategies in terms of movements being able to dominate states or cities or whatever. And then there's the national problem, which is incomprehensibly complex and difficult because of how we elect people, that there are only 2 ballot lines, that we have an electoral college, that we have a Senate, we have all of these things that like put you into very difficult positions. And to be really blunt about it, right now, nationally, right, our electoral strategy has to be just staying alive, right? That things that have happened already are better than I would have expected, but we are heading into a midterm in which 90% of the time, Democrats in the past, this situation, 90% Democrats will lose both chambers. And that even less noticed, right, is that when we went into 2020, we had a real advantage, which was that in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Nevada, and Arizona, Democrats were running the election. And even though the state legislatures in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Arizona are gerrymandered and will continue to be Republican, the actual running of the election was done by Democrats. All of them are up for election again in 2022. And any of them that lose, those like half-point victories could be completely flipped, right? Not to mention that when any of those states flip, we'll just see the kind of thing that happened in Georgia, Florida, and Arizona already. You'll have a gerrymandered legislature and a Republican governor. They'll do the thing, and Michigan will be Georgia, right? So it's that perilous, right? And then you get to 2024, and instead of the 2025 being Pelosi and McConnell, it's McCarthy and McConnell. When the votes go to get certified, you can spin it out. So in terms of national politics, this is survival, right? We don't get to make transformative change through national politics at the moment, but we can have what little we have taken away. And that like points you in like a particular direction, which is actually along the lines of how we succeeded in 2020. But to the point about being humble and like thinking again, I think one of the big things we have to get past, there are 2 things, since we don't have much time, that I don't want to take too much, but 2 things to get past. The first is that we just have to come to terms with the fact that we have a constitution that is so anti-democratic, that is such a straitjacket for supremacists and capitalists, that there actually is no solution inside the system, right? Just have to, and that has to force us to think outside the constitutional box. And the second thing, and it like runs through this conversation, I listened to some of the earlier conversations. I think one of the big mistakes that progressives have made in how they think about the role of progressive organizations in elections is the sort of like high school civics book text sense of democracy, where we go out, we get a lot of people to vote for a candidate, and they're going to do something good for us. And we name the going out and knocking on doors as power, but we're the only ones who think that, right? It really doesn't carry weight to people who get elected. What you have to do is elect people who start by agreeing with you, who are part of the movement, who are actually going to want to do what you're doing, not what you want, not feel like, oh, well, they knocked 100,000 doors for me, so I better vote for this. That just doesn't happen in the real world. Go ahead.
Let me connect that to something that Ensei said, because on the one hand, you're saying that our challenge right now is just to survive. And even though we might want the national government to be transformative, this is just not one of those times. I would say, surprisingly, it has been one of those times, in that Joe Biden, who was the centrist in the race, gets elected and says, I think I'll spend $5 trillion. And as a consequence of that, a lot of working class white people, as well as people of color, are starting to say, wow, my government is actually delivering stuff for me. And I guess the question is, does that create any kind of an opening with voters who were seduced by Trump to give government and maybe even Democrats a second look? And does that cut against some of the pessimism that we would otherwise have for 2022? I mean, I think, let me ask the folks who are really working on the ground, whether that's too hopeful or whether you're beginning to see any of that. Ense or Afia?
I'll say this, we have millions of high quality face-to-face conversations with Georgians every year. And what I have learned is that, yes, while we are obsessed with polls and polling and candidates and their campaigns and their messaging, that people really care about, like, folks have hopes and fears for themselves, for their families, and for their communities. And so the way that we train our organizers is that you have twice as many ears as you do mouths. And so the conversations that we're having every day is that we're asking people what it is that they care about. What will you get out of your bed and fight for? What's the thing that you can't stand to see continue? And what's your highest aspiration for yourself and your family and for your community? And we constantly work to build campaigns, to recruit and train candidates that will, again, co-govern with the people and help us create the conditions where we make those things real. So for example, I know that defund the police is very third rail in our movement and in a lot of spaces. But we just commemorated the 1-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd yesterday. And I remember this time last year, actually like a couple of weeks later in the year, going out to protest. And we were being very disciplined about not being in public, not allowing our organizers to go out to in-person events. But there was this energy amongst young people and people of color and folks who were saying, like, enough. And so what do? We took our clipboards out to the protest and our mask, right? And met people where they were. And obviously in the sort of woker than thou folks who were saying, voting's not gonna do anything, voting's not gonna change our material circumstances. Is not going to stop the cops from killing us. So what do? We talked about municipal elections, that yes, it's 2020 and everybody is talking about Joe Biden and the presidential election. But don't you know that the mayor of Atlanta appoints the police chief, and that it's the city council that determines, that sets the police budget. That's who negotiates with the police union. So we need to get our stuff in order for the 2021 municipal elections that are happening in Atlanta and cities all across the state of Georgia. That resonated, that talking to people about the fact that, you can never, that the jury pools in Georgia are pulled from the list of registered voters. And so if you were ever, you're never going to be called to serve on a jury in an officer involved shooting if you're not a registered voter. And I imagine that you would bring your experiences, this experience today, into the jury deliberation room should you have the opportunity to serve, right? And so when you think, going back to your previous question, there are an extraordinary number of opportunities. If we're thinking long-term, if we're thinking about winning and then defending those wins beyond one election cycle, then we definitely have to think about municipal elections and building the pipeline, the candidate pipeline, the organizer and leadership pipeline. And again, talking to people about what we have won creates sort of opportunities in conversation. It creates opportunities for us to recruit people. And I think I'm inspired by this moment. I don't operate and move in the spirit of fear. I think that we've done it before and we can do it again. And I also think that the opportunity ahead of us to do everything that we can to create and sustain the demand for the passage of HR 1 and doing a better job of talking about setting a federal standard for elections as a prophylactic, as a defense against all of the BS that is coming from this very desperate, very aggressive version of the GOP.
Thank you. Afia or Brian, any comments on that?
Yeah, if I may, so I want to sort of try to tie a couple threads together. I mean, I think Mike is right in the probabilities, and I risk this getting like written on my epitaph, but NSA will never stop teasing me, because about 2 years ago I was like, I don't know if we're going to be able to win Georgia, and you know, I feel like I think the probabilities are that Democrats lose a chamber, and yet I think one of the questions before us is how do we capitalize on the momentum and the demographic trends, which aren't destiny but are opportunity, as you say, NSA. So totally agree there. A couple other elements I would bring in, like I think we're right to be concerned about the what we're up against electorally in 2022. I do think we have to put in play multiple levels of activity that will play out over the medium and long term. So it's everything from you know, sort of scenario. I think we've learned as a movement to do better scenario planning, for one, because none of us was ready for Trump. And I think we were much more ready for all of the possibilities. And I think that actually helped protect the elections, how ready the movement was. The sort of readiness work was very meaningful. But I think we need to do that again and have executive strategies ready in 2023 if need be, and so on. But I want to look beyond the federal and sort of draw on the point about there are entire strategies in cities, and you know, a lot of the movements that have been built in the last decade really are sort of bottom up in cities and states. A lot of the worker organizing, a lot of the community organizing, and so I do think we are in a sort of movement moment context, and we also don't know. Millions of people were in motion over the last year around the movement for Black Lives and around anti-Trumpism and around the elections. I don't think the jury's not back yet as to what the long-term uptake of all of that is. And I want to go back to something Hahrie Hahn said in the first panel, which is there's sort of if we build the structures and build the context for people to engage, I'm trying to tie the electoral and the movement together here, but I think it's on us to be creative in the next couple of years to create those openings. And then something that Deepak Bhargava said, he sort of, you know, was asking the question, what are the models for how we scale up organizing? And he said there's three tools that he could think of, which resonated with me. One is public policy, things like the National Labor Relations Act, sort of two is innovations in our practice. So as I said in my early comments, I think there's a lot of innovation in our methodology. And I share the concern. We need more independent financing and grassroots funded activity. And then third is sort of movements. But I feel like I think we just have to set in motion and sort of inculcate that, while also, you know, heavy attention to the map going into 2022. For those of you that I don't work in that part of the sector anymore, but I think we have to set some things in motion that are not such that if we are not able to hold both chambers in 2022, we also have lots of other tools in our toolbox, if you will. So
great. Afia, any comment before we go to audience questions?
All right, I just say briefly because I want to make sure we get the audience. And I think, you know, where I'm thinking of this is beyond one cycle, right? So clearly, where I agree with Michael is what we have is a system, right, that has kind of set up things that are less than beneficial, right, for folks who are in movement space, who are in labor, who are in racial and social justice organizing. So taking this macro view of how do we do this protective, as NSA said, prophylactic to deal with whatever falls out of 2022, but also for the long term, how are we doing, to NSA's point again, the training and the recruitment, not just of candidates, right, but of the base that needs to support it and keep those folks accountable. How are we doing the supporting of the policymakers and the thinkers, right? And that's not a 1 to 2 year, right? That's a 7, 10, if we're honest, a 20-year strategy to really being able to not just find and inspire, but raise, right? And bring those folks through the fruition. And then I think we have to really be thinking through, how do we hold this, right? Because on our side, we're never able just to do one thing, right? So we've got to be both fighting the fight, building the protective wall, while moving forward on a strategy to be both like train, find, sustain, hold, and put them out there. So I think some of that speaks to, with my organizer hat on, it, like that's about an understanding of funding, of support, right? support is both monetary, but also with teaching and technical assistance and how we're working together. When I think about the importance of labor and racial justice organizations coming together, filling in gaps for each other historically, I think we're going to have to use both that playbook and think through other things to deal with this interesting and difficult time.
Thank you. Before we go to audience questions, I wanted to mention we did have a fifth panelist scheduled. I'm hoping she can still join us, but time is running out, and that's Raquel Terán, whose life sort of personifies the linkage between movement organizing and electoral organizing. She went from being a community organizer to getting elected state rep to being the leader of the movement against Arizona Senate Bill 1070, which was the viciously anti-immigrant bill. And then she was the leader of the successful effort to recall State Senator Russell Pierce, who was the sponsor of that bill. And now she was recently elected chair of the state Democratic Party. So there it is, the connection between movement building and electoral politics. I hope Raquel will still join us at some point. Anyway, here's an interesting question. What are the differences and similarities between mobilizing for an issue or around an issue and mobilizing for a candidate?
I mean, one challenge has been that we saw that after the Obama election and the way he drew in millions of volunteers, I felt like for those of us in the community organizing sector at the time, it was a real challenge. And I felt it again with Bernie, that the way people come into presidential elections as volunteers, like there's a whole question that came up in the first panel about what's the relationship between full-time organizers and volunteer organizers, and sort of what's the right ratio and staffing model. And those are really fundamental questions, because it gets at so many questions, but it gets to scale and sustainability. I think you started to see some in 2020 where you were seeing, I think, greater numbers of volunteers at scale coming into movement, in sort of movement aligned political work and movement activity. And I think we started to get better at it, but I think that's it's still a challenge, like the ability of high profile presidential campaigns. I bet it's actually not dissimilar from down ballot races. Like I think presidentials exercise a unique pull on volunteers. So that's one sort of obvious one that I think has been a real question, because we've all admired some of the organizing of those political campaigns and then realized, well, that's not really quite so replicable. So.
Are there thoughts on the relationship between mobilizing around issues and mobilizing around elections?
I mean, just to plus one Brian's point, I think sustainability is also important. Also, listen, we don't elect messiahs, and I think building a long-term effort to win around an individual is definitely setting you up for disappointment. People, we're humans, people disappoint you. And so I think that I think the difference is sustainability, that we can keep talking about wages and clean air and clean water and safety, I think are evergreen issues that are always going to be at the top of folks' minds, and that we can always bring people in. But even some of our favorites are starting to look a little funny in the light. I think about how movement talks about Obama in 2008 versus how movement talks about Obama today. And there are very stark differences. And again, a lot of it has to do with the idea that we can't pin our ambitions on an individual, even if they are dynamic and look great in dad jeans.
Here's another question. Michael, were you starting to say
something? I was going to, but if you want to move on to another.
No, please go ahead.
No, I was going to say, even go a little bit further and say, I think as now sort of playing the age card, one of the things that's really dramatic to me is that I became aware of politics in the end of the 1960s, right? And the end of the Vietnam War, civil rights movement, all of that. And the idea that any of us would have thought that electing a president would be what would be transformative would look like you were just stupid. And that something happened like where people started thinking that you elect a president, like that's all you got to do, right? Change America, like just get a bunch of people to go vote and it'll work. As if you don't have all the corporations, all the institutions lined up against you, right? That's the whole idea of the movement we're in, right? And to think that there's this, that we can make it transformative by voting for human beings is just nuts, right? The only way you change is by confronting power directly, right? If you go back to sort of the creation of the labor movement in the 30s, it wasn't because the labor movement had good lobbyists or had good policy papers. It's because they shut capitalism down, right? And at that point, essentially the Wagner Act is collective bargaining unions, is the treaty between capitalism and labor that changes the rules of the game, right? But it wasn't like we thought, oh, elect these cool people and they'll give us a thing, right? And it never is different. And to also pull back to the earlier question, it's like the reason that Biden is able to give away great things, which is awesome, right? But really notice that power is not being given away. Power is not being reallocated in anything that's happening. And when you don't like change the horrible imbalance in power in this United States, you can get these brief periods where you do a little better. But you have to have power. You have to rebalance power. And that power doesn't come from voting. The power comes from confronting capitalism, confronting supremacy, actually forcing the issue. And that's where we've just completely lost muscle memory, where we just revert to elections. And the problem is that we've gotten so attenuated in our capacity that we still have to win elections to keep the bit from going over the abyss. And since I'm when you invite me, you're inviting gloom. The point about remember in this whole Biden thing, we have a 6-3 Supreme Court, right? That is the goalie for our opponents. And so that it hasn't had to come into the game yet, but be ready.
I just, let me demote myself to the role of panelist here.
Yeah.
A bit. Mike, isn't it both and? I mean, don't we win elections to help create space for the kind of seizing of power that you're talking about? Because
it's completely cause and
Wagner was actually a factor in the Wagner Act, was he not?
Right. No, it's cause, absolutely. I'm saying it's cause and effect, but the table stakes are power.
Yeah. Oh, I agree.
Right. The table stakes are actually exerting power in society.
Yep.
And then you get a seat at the legislative and executive table.
One piece of good news is the Obama years disabused us of I think one is the way people I think you're saying we were neoliberalized in our own thinking about power, B, Obama, the Obama years sort of took that away from many of us that might have thought otherwise. And then third, I do think there's I think a lot of people were probably clear-eyed, but thought that the breakthrough, the ways in which race and capital aren't identical. And so the racial breakthrough of Obama and electing the first Black president, that was an achievement, and it didn't, and then obviously with the way the Great Recession went down and the sort of aftermath with Wall Street sort of was a reminder there too. So I feel like the interplay of our own strategic weaknesses, but the good news, I feel like that's pretty wiped out post Obama years, and I think we're all pleasantly surprised. Not all, but many are on the early Biden days. But I think people are much more clear-eyed about what we have to do in the period ahead. So.
Well, you go back to Roosevelt and beyond Roosevelt, the interplay of racism and capitalism as the two original sins here, and how racism hobbled the attempt to reform capitalism, and how capitalism used racism to divide the working class. And you can tell that story in every single era going back centuries. And maybe this is a moment when we can get beyond some of that. Here's another question. How do you balance mobilizing and organizing and listening? I know that People's Action has really done pioneering work on deep canvas and active listening and trying to get a deeper sense of what is really motivating people who seem to be really bad people, who maybe you could move them in a way closer to what we believe if you could listen hard enough and get them to appreciate what their own interests are. Is that kind of pie in the sky? Is my optimism offsetting my pessimism? Or is there something there that can come out of deep listening that is potentially transformative?
Listen, I'm biased, but I think there's a there. You know, this deep canvas that People's Action is sponsoring in states across the South is this crazy idea that if you go in and you talk to someone, right, and get an understanding of a bit of who they are and talk about your experiences and why that's affected you, with a moment of, I wouldn't say no judgment because this is the real world, but with a moment of candor and respect to listen and hear, that you may be able to move folks to think about things differently and to act in a way that may in fact be more beneficial to their self-interest, right? And so it's taken a lot of work in training folks. You know, it's a Herculean journey, even in the best conditions, right? Like prior to the COVID pandemic, people across the nation did a lot of deep thought on this and training and then, you know, trying it out and redoing scripts and going back out and being very clear with their data so that we're making sure that we're doing this to bring it to scale, and made some great success and strides there. And then you have COVID hits, right? And so what do folks do? What do organizers? We do it the hard way. We don't pack up and leave. Okay, we're gonna take this to the phones. We're gonna modify our efforts because we have to move this forward. So I think it's that type of tools, these type of new things that we have to do to engage individuals outside of, to Michael's point, like a body politic, right? Like engage people about who they are, right? And what they hope. One thing that NSA raises, what we always talk to people about, like, what do you want for yourself and your family? That question triggers people. When you ask them, what do you want for yourself and your family, right? And to move backwards from there. And I would say often things aren't put in that, right? I mean, Robert, you raised about the issues of race and capitalism. It's always against something or someone who's going to take from this thing that I have that's supposed to be for me and or my race or my gender. And so this asking of what do you hope for you and your family? Sidebar who you think is taking it. What do you want for yourself and your family? All right, well, what do you think is going to get there? What do you think this bill is going to do? I think it's extremely impactful, and it requires folks to get into uncomfortable situations, right? To the idea of confronting power. I think the first thing we have to do is put ourselves in uncomfortable situations and challenge people to sit with difficult thoughts, right? And move them to do those collective actions of challenging power, right? How do you go and take on the boss? Usually you don't take them on by him or her or them on by yourself, right? That's a fool's errand. So how do you take these conversations where you're able to get people to move together, to challenge power, to start, right, those small wins that allow people to believe that they could overturn or change structures? So I think that's a very important step in doing that. The data that we've gotten from it, I think, is extremely, you know, I temper my enthusiasm. This is my very excited face, but I'm very excited. So I think it can move us to learning things we haven't learned before. I think it shows a lot of times demographics are counted down or counted out. It challenges that notion and shows that some work can be done. Now it has to be scaled up. It should be invested in, and folks should think about this differently. But I think we can take tools from this in all of our daily work in organizing, and in both political and in individuals.
Other comments?
Yeah, so I'll start by saying, like, things sure to be that you all disagree with until hopefully a minute and a half later you'll agree. I think that this panel, all of this is still trapped in like neoliberal thinking, and that which is basically that we think about everything one person at a time. And we don't have the vocabulary or the capacity to think about groups of people, right? And I'll come back to that in a second. And that arguably the only people you have to recommend listening to, leaders you should recommend listening to, are leaders who aren't actually part of the authentic community they're trying to lead. Because when they're part of the authentic community they're trying to lead, that is their experience, right? When you think you got to listen, and we aren't, so it's important, but I'm saying that the great leaders of movements have come from, were moving out of their own experience, not a sense of, I'm going to lead this group, which is very modern, very recent. But all we were talking, when we talk about like knocking on door by door by door, think back, it used to be that the way you did political communication was you get a big rally together. Look what Trump does, right? He's not, right? There's like a power in bringing people together and seeing together that energy and excitement, right? But we have this sort of like, we're going to listen to each voter, we're going to talk to each voter, we're going to convince each voter, and that's neoliberalism, because it says that the elections are just the aggregation of everybody's opinion. And that's what like takes our power away, right? The way to get power is to build the collective organization or movement that together has the power to move things.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that elections are, I started with my hot take, I don't care about voting. And I think I will end there. I think that elections are inflection points, that they are opportunities for us to test the power that we are building in between elections every day, and to flex that power, that you know, we are thinking about what we can win for our families and for our communities. And that when I think about the work of the New Georgia Project, or the role that we seek to play in the communities, it's a convener, it's a container, it's access to resources, it's an amplifier, it's an issue organizing and an electoral organizing home for folks in communities across the state of Georgia. We don't believe that our lived experiences automatically make us experts in the priorities of our communities. And so, yes, I am an immigrant. I became a US citizen my senior year in high school. I'm a Black woman, public school educated, who lives in the South, working class, baby union organizer. And we still ask questions, and we still study, and we still seek understanding as we are building consensus and the power that we need in order to sort of shape the world that we want to live in. And so, yeah, I think I understand that we are talking about electoral organizing, but I think it's really important, at least for us and for the House of NGP, that we are very deliberate and intentional about putting it in its appropriate place in our sort of on the organizing spectrum, if you will, as a part of our larger strategy to win the things that we need for our families.
I would just add to Mike's point that to some extent, the individual door knocking or texting or telephoning was not necessarily the result of organizers converting to neoliberalism. It had something to do with the pandemic. There were lots and lots of mass rallies in 2018 and 2019, beginning with the women's marches right after Trump was elected. And there would have been, had Democrats and progressives not been more prudent about not infecting each other, while Trump was willing to be infectious in both senses of the word with his base. But I agree with you that it has to be more than individual conversations. I mean, the great civil rights movement of the 60s and the great labor movement of the 30s, those were mass movements. They weren't just individual door knocks. Before we wrap up, final round of comments, Afia or Brian?
mean, this last conversation is really fascinating. I feel like just around it is provocative, Mike, and I think I sort of half agree and half not so much in the sense that I think what people are trying to do is, like, we have a challenge where if you're trying to build a majoritarian political movement, you need some alignment, and there's basically not a majority constituency that's aligned. So a lot of there's different elements to it. Some of what you said, Ensei, which is the active listening is really, it's less about not understanding, it's more about, like, that's how you communicate and that's how you draw people in. And as Hahrie pointed out on the first panel, like, so much of building community is actually the process that goes into it, and so there's an element of that. But there's sort of a different problem where, like, I reached out to a bunch of organizers before this panel just to check in and say, what were your lessons from the election? And I tried to aggregate some of that. And, a couple of them said, look, working class men across race were pretty challenging in a variety of ways. And you saw that in the numbers in Trump gaining ground I think with Black and Latinx men, for example. And so I think there's an element where people are cross-pressured ideologically and are trying to decide, is it culture, is it economics, or is it one of any number of other dynamics? So we're trying to sort of recruit people across that divide into a particular approach, and people are complex. So this has been a great conversation. I look forward to continuing at the restaurant with y'all in person soon. So,
last thoughts, Sophia?
Sure, I'd say this has given me a lot to chew on, and I would just re-emphasize that none of this can be an either or, right? I guess why I'm left with tension is the idea that mass movements don't start with talking to some individuals, right? And so there has to be some connection for folks to take to action, inspire others to do so, or else it makes me feel like things would be diffuse and transactional, right? Like what moves folks to action, if not urgency, immediacy, and a belief in something can be different, but someone who can provide guidance and say that this can happen. And ideally, from there, we get to scale with route, like so on and so forth. So I definitely want to lift up that we have to do things. Listen, things have to be done larger to deal with the scale of what's happening, but don't ever want to lose the idea that at some point folks have to engage directly, right? And that should be or could be a lightning rod to move some of these larger movements. So I'm excited for further conversations like this.
Okay, and there will be further conversations like this. Let me just mention a couple of things. Thanks to all of you and for all of the panelists during this half-day conference and the previous two panels. There was a momentary glitch with our link. So if your friends and colleagues had difficulty getting on, please know that this has been recorded. If you search American Prospect YouTube, it will take you to the recording of this on our YouTube channel. There will also be further information if you go to prospect.org/organize. We are going to continue this. We are going to continue featuring articles about this. We'll have a follow-up discussion. And again, thanks to everybody who participated as a panelist and who participated at home. So to be continued, the struggle never ends. Thank you so much.
Great.